There is a particular kind of silence that exists only between planets, not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of distance itself, of light taking years to travel and finding, at the end of its journey, nothing waiting to receive it. It was in this silence that Beerus, god of destruction, lord of Universe 7, had been drifting for the better part of an afternoon that did not, technically, exist on any calendar a mortal would recognize. He was not doing anything. This was, by his own estimation, the correct use of his time. The god lay draped across a cushion of woven starlight that Whis had conjured for him hours ago, one arm thrown over his eyes, tail flicking with the slow, irritated rhythm of something that had been promised a meal and had not yet received it. Below them, though below was a generous word for a direction that shifted depending on which way Beerus turned his head, the void unspooled in long ribbons of violet and black, threaded here and there with the cold fire of distant suns. "Whis," Beerus said, without opening his eyes, "I am bored." "You are always bored, my lord," Whis replied, in the tone of a man remarking on the weather. He stood a short distance away, staff resting lightly against one shoulder, gazing out at the drifting stars with the serene attentiveness of someone who had seen this particular performance 10,000 times before and expected to see it 10,000 times again. "It is, I believe, your natural state, between meals." "It is a tragic state." Beerus lowered his arm and squinted up at nothing in particular. "We were promised earth food. Where is my earth food? Earth, my lord, is presently occupied. There was mention of a tournament, Goku, I believe, and several dozen fighters he collected under the impression that you would find it entertaining." "I do not find it entertaining. I find it loud." Beerus rolled onto his side. "Take me somewhere quiet, somewhere with good food and no shouting men in orange." "As you wish." Whis raised his staff, and the fabric of the space around them began to fold inward, not violently, but with the smooth, practiced ease of a hand closing a book. It was a motion Beerus had felt 10,000 times, as familiar as his own heartbeat, and he closed his eyes again, already half anticipating the particular gravity of whichever world Whis had chosen, the particular smell of whichever kitchen. The fold caught. It was a small thing at first, a hitch, a stutter, the barest resistance where there should have been none, the sensation, if Beerus had to describe it, of a key turning in a lock that had quietly, invisibly, been altered. Whis's brow creased for the first time in several centuries. "That's odd," he said. "What's odd?" "Something is—" Whis tilted his head, staff angling a fraction, reading currents that no mortal instrument could have detected. Somewhere, impossibly far below and impossibly close at once, something was pulling. Not with force, nothing in this universe or the next had the raw power to pull on a god's own passage between worlds, but with a strange, insistent wrongness, like a splinter of foreign intention driven into the seam of the fold itself, a working. Old and ugly and half-finished, the kind of magic that mortals stumbled into when they reached for doors they didn't understand existed. "Someone is knocking, my lord," rather rudely. Beerus opened one eye. "Knocking on what?" "On the door I am currently using to take us to dinner." Whis's tone remained light, but there was the faintest edge of genuine curiosity beneath it now, an emotion so rare on his face that Beerus actually sat up to look. It shouldn't be possible, and yet. "Then close it harder." "I intend to. Though I confess, my lord, I am rather curious who is arrogant enough to try." He didn't get the chance to find out gently. Whatever crude hand had reached into the fabric of the fold chose that exact moment to wrench, with the desperate, thrashing violence of something that had found a door, and having no idea what it had found, decided the correct response was to kick it as hard as possible. The fold didn't break. Nothing mortal could break it, but it lurched, the smooth unspooling of space snapping sideways like a rope pulled taut and released. And Beerus, god of destruction, who had not been caught off guard by anything in this universe since before several of its stars had finished forming, found himself falling. Not through space, through a door, small and crooked and reeking of iron and old blood, torn open somewhere in the dark cellar of a world he had never once had reason to visit. The cellar, for what it was worth, had not been built to survive this. It sat 3 floors beneath a shattered pharmaceutical warehouse on the eastern edge of London, in a district the maps still called Wapping, though the maps hadn't been updated to reflect what Wapping had become in the months since Millennium's chippers first started surfacing. The lab above had been abandoned in a hurry. Beakers left mid-pour, a chalkboard covered in half-finished sigils borrowed from 3 different occult traditions and understood properly by none of them, a generator still humming uselessly in the dark. It had belonged, until recently, to a small and desperate cell of Millennium sympathizers who had gotten their hands on a fragment of something they shouldn't have, an artifact half-Nazi occult relic, half something far older, salvaged from a dig in the Carpathians and smuggled into England in a diplomatic pouch. They had wanted to open a door. They had wanted, specifically, to reach into whatever lay beyond the world and pull out something with teeth, something that would let their failing chipper program leapfrog Hellsing's monster entirely. They had gotten what they wanted, in the way that people who reach for doors without understanding what a door is always eventually do. The chalk circle on the cellar floor, 6 feet across, drawn in 3 overlapping alphabets and a great deal of confidence, went up like a struck match, and in the space where it had been, where a heartbeat ago, there had been nothing but stale air and the smell of ozone, a god fell out of the sky and landed, cat-like, without so much as a stumble, on the cracked concrete. For a long moment, Beerus simply stood there, tail lashing once, twice, taking in his surroundings with the flat, unimpressed expression of someone assessing a hotel room that had not lived up to its brochure. It was, he decided, a basement. A small, damp, poorly lit basement, smelling of candle wax and copper and something underneath that, something rotten, something that had been dead for a while and had not entirely stayed that way. There was no food. There was no Weiss. There was notably a great deal of dust settling from the ceiling where his arrival had cracked several support beams without him particularly meaning it to. "Weiss," Beerus said to the empty room. The empty room did not answer. He tried again, a little louder, more out of principle than expectation. "Weiss." Still nothing. Beerus's ears flattened. This was, he reflected, an extremely poor start to what was supposed to have been dinner. Somewhere above him, muffled through concrete and rubble, he heard voices, several of them, low and urgent, arguing in the clipped cadence of men who had just felt their basement shake and were trying very hard to convince themselves it was nothing. Beerus tilted his head toward the sound, with the mild, incurious attention of a cat noticing a bird it hadn't yet decided was worth chasing. Then the smell reached him. Beneath the wax and the copper and the rot, something else, something cooking, several streets over, meat and onions and fat rendering in a pan, carried on a draft from some cracked window or vent. Beerus's expression did not change, but his tail went very still, the way it always did when something had, at last, gotten his attention. He looked around the ruined basement once more, at the still smoking chalk circle, at the shattered support beam, at the general indignity of the entire situation, and made a decision that would, in the fullness of time, come to be regarded by 3 separate intelligence organizations as the single worst piece of luck any of them had encountered in living memory. He decided to go find dinner himself. The stairs up from the cellar had been reduced to splinters and a slope of loose brick by the god's landing, which was, if anything, an improvement. Beerus didn't so much climb them as walk through the space where they had been, and the ceiling parted for him with a soft crumbling sigh rather than any particular resistance, the concrete simply losing the argument for existing in that exact configuration a half second before he arrived. The men upstairs, 4 of them,
Millennium sympathizers in stained lab coats over mismatched fatigues, the kind of true believers who had signed on for the promise of a world remade in the image of a war their grandfathers had lost, did not handle the sight of a lavender-skinned deity rising through their floor with any particular grace. The one nearest the stairwell, a broad man with a shaved head and a service pistol he'd never actually fired at anything that could fire back, did what frightened men with guns generally do. He raised it, hands shaking only slightly, and shouted something about staying back, about this being restricted, about God knew what. And then, because fear rarely improves judgment, he pulled the trigger.
The bullet crossed the 8 feet of ruined lab between them in the time it took Beerus to blink, which was, from the god's perspective, considerably slower than the time it took him to be mildly annoyed by it. He didn't dodge. He didn't need to.
The round struck him squarely in the chest and simply stopped, flattening against skin that had shrugged off attacks capable of erasing solar systems, and dropped to the floor with a soft, almost apologetic clink. Beerus looked down at where it had hit him. Then he looked up at the man who had fired it. "That," Beerus said, in a voice that was quiet and almost conversational, and somehow filled the entire ruined laboratory anyway, was extremely rude. The man did not get the chance to apologize, or run, or do much of anything at all. Beerus raised one finger, the same idle, almost bored gesture he'd used 1,000 times on 1,000 worlds. The gesture that had, on more than one occasion, made entire civilizations reconsider their life choices in the half-second before they ceased to have any life left to choose with. And where the man had been standing, there was, very briefly, a shimmer of violet-black static, and then there was nothing at all. No blood, no sound, no evidence he had ever occupied that particular 6 feet of floor space, save for the pistol, which clattered down alone into the space where his hand had been holding it. The remaining 3 men did not shoot. They did not, in fact, do anything so decisive as flee, because fleeing requires the belief that flight is possible, and something in the animal core of each of them had already understood, in the half-second it took their colleague to stop existing, that flight was not a category of response available to them anymore. They simply stood, frozen, in the ozone and candle wax stink of their failed laboratory, and watched a god who had just erased a man without so much as raising his voice, glance idly around the room, as though the whole thing had already bored him. "Now," Beerus said, turning his magenta eyes on the nearest of the 3, a thin, nervous woman, clutching a clipboard to her chest like it might somehow protect her. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I would very much appreciate an answer that doesn't waste any more of my time than your friend already has." "Where," he said, "is the food?" Nobody answered him, because nobody could quite process that this, the erasure, the flat casual violence of it, the utter absence of malice in a voice that had just unmade a human being, was the setup to a question about dinner. Beerus's tail flicked once, patience visibly thinning. "I will ask one more time," he said, "and then I will start being unpleasant about it." It was, ultimately, the thin woman with the clipboard who found her voice first, not out of courage, but because the alternative, standing silently while the god of destruction's patience ran out, had become abruptly and obviously worse. There's a chip shop," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "2 streets over. It should still be open. They don't close till—" "Good." Beerus's expression didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders eased, the way a held breath releases. He turned toward the shattered front wall of the building, shattered not by any assault, but simply by the fact that walls, in the presence of a sufficiently irritated god, tended to lose their conviction, and paused only long enough to glance back over his shoulder. "You should get a new hobby," he told the surviving 3, with the mild, unbothered tone of a man offering unsolicited advice to strangers on a train. "This one seems to attract a poor class of visitor."
And then he was gone, walking out into the fog and ash-choked night air of a London none of them had ever properly seen, toward the distant, blessed smell of frying batter and vinegar, leaving behind him a hole in the world roughly the shape of a man, a ruined laboratory, and 3 witnesses who would spend the rest of their considerably shortened lives trying and failing to adequately describe what they had just seen to anyone who would listen.
The first the outside world heard of it came in fragments, the way these things always did, in a city that had already spent the better part of a year learning not to ask too many questions about the things that happened after dark. A constable named Terry Hobbs, 26 years on the force, and 11 months into the private, unspoken understanding that his final years of service were going to involve things his training had never once prepared him for, took the call at 11:47 p.m. Reports of an explosion, structural collapse, possible gas leak in a warehouse district that had already been flagged twice that year for unusual activity, the department's own careful euphemism for the sort of incidents that got quietly folded into round-table jurisdiction before the papers could get hold of them. What Hobbs found when he and his partner pulled up outside the wreckage of the pharmaceutical warehouse was not consistent with an explosion of any kind he'd ever been trained to recognize. There was no scorching, no shrapnel. A section of the building simply wasn't there anymore, the edges of the missing space too clean, too absolute, as though someone had taken an eraser to a technical drawing rather than demolished a structure with force. 3 survivors were found huddled in the wreckage of the basement, uninjured, catatonic, repeating variations of the same fragmented account to anyone who'd listen. A purple man. A purple man came up through the floor and made David disappear. He didn't even look angry. Hobbs wrote it up as best he could, because that was the job, and because he'd learned by now that the reports that sounded the maddest were exactly the ones that got picked up fastest by whatever quiet channel fed information to the people who actually dealt with London's stranger problems. He didn't know where the report went after it left his hands. He didn't especially want to. He did not know, could not have known, filling out his forms in the cold fluorescent light of a ruined warehouse at midnight, that 4 streets away, in a chip shop that had genuinely never expected a customer quite like this one, a small lavender-skinned deity was currently eating his way through the entire evening's stock of fried cod with an expression of profound, uncomplicated satisfaction, having paid for it, bewilderingly, to the owner who would later swear this detail to anyone who'd listen, with a small, dense, almost impossibly heavy chunk of what appeared to be solid gold, produced from absolutely nowhere and handed over with the casual indifference of a man tossing a coin to a busker. "This is acceptable," Beerus announced, to no one in particular, around a mouthful of chips. "Whis, are you hearing this? Acceptable food, finally." Whis did not answer, because Whis was not there, was, in fact, at that exact moment, standing very still amid the drifting stars of the space between worlds, staff held motionless, gold eyes fixed on the ragged, still-smoking tier in the fabric of reality where his god had fallen through. His expression, for the first time in longer than most mortal civilizations had existed, had gone entirely, uncharacteristically serious. "Oh dear," Whis said quietly, to no one at all. "That's going to be a problem for somebody." He did not follow immediately. There was, after all, no need to rush. Lord Beerus was, whatever else might be true of him, functionally indestructible, and rushing into an unfamiliar tier in causality, without first understanding what had made it struck Whis as precisely the sort of impulsive behavior he existed to discourage. He would follow soon, but first he decided, watching the edges of the tear pulse faintly with residual and profoundly foreign magic, he would take a moment to understand exactly what strange, small, dangerous world had just reached up, and without meaning to, taken hold of a god. Terry Hobbs's report reached the desk of a junior analyst at Hellsing's London liaison office at 6:15 the following morning, filed alongside 24 other overnight incidents from a city that generated them the way other cities generated traffic accidents. It sat, unremarkable amid the pile, for the better part of 3 hours. A warehouse collapse, 3 catatonic witnesses, a missing person with no blood, no body, and no explanation beyond the words "Purple Man," repeated with the flat, hollow insistence of people who had stopped expecting to be believed. It might have sat there longer, filed and forgotten among 100 stranger incidents in a city that had learned to expect strangeness, if not for a second report that crossed the same desk not 40 minutes later. This one from a chip shop owner in Wapping, filing an insurance claim for a broken till drawer and attaching, with evident bafflement, a photograph of the small, dense gold ingot a customer had used to pay for his order the previous night. The analyst, a careful young man named Price, 3 years into a job that had taught him to take absolutely nothing in this city at face value, looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at the warehouse report. Then, slowly, he reached for the internal line that connected his desk directly to the Hellsing organization's main estate, because whatever else this was, it was not gas leaks or explained away nonsense, and Sir Integra Hellsing had made it exceptionally clear, on more than one occasion, precisely what she wanted to hear about the moment anything in London stopped making sense. He picked up the phone. Somewhere across the city, in a study lined with old books and older weapons, a telephone began, quietly, to ring. Integra, Fairbrook Wingate's Hellsing, had a policy about phone calls that arrived before 7 in the morning, and the policy was simple. They were never good, and she answered them anyway, because the alternative, being caught unprepared by whatever London had produced overnight, was worse than the interruption itself. She was already awake when the call came through, seated at the long desk in her study, with the curtains still drawn and a cigar burning down, untouched, in the ashtray at her elbow. She had not slept well. She rarely did these days. The incognito business had put the entire organization on a knife's edge, chippers surfacing faster than her people could track them, and every report that crossed her desk carried the particular weight of a woman who understood, with total clarity, that whatever was coming was going to be worse than what had already arrived. She picked up the receiver on the second ring. Hellsing, Sir Integra, Price's voice, careful and precise, the voice of a man who had learned exactly how much editorializing his employer tolerated in a report, which was none. Apologies for the hour. 2 incidents overnight in Wapping, filed separately, that I believe are connected. I think you'll want to see them before the morning briefing. Go on. A warehouse collapse, structural, except there's no structural cause we can identify. A section of the building is simply gone. Clean edges, no debris consistent with an explosion, no scorching. 3 survivors, uninjured but non-responsive to standard questioning, all giving the same account. A man, described consistently as purple-skinned, came up through the floor of the basement and caused a 4th individual to, their word, disappear. No blood, no remains. Integra's expression did not change, but her hand, resting on the desk, went very slightly still. And the second incident? A chip shop 3 streets over, the owner's filing an insurance claim over a damaged till, says a customer paid in solid gold, an ingot, roughly the size of a bar of soap, handed over without comment. I've had the photograph run past our appraiser. It's genuine, 24 karat, no hallmark, no provenance. It simply doesn't exist on any registry. Description of the customer. Consistent with the warehouse report, sir. Purple-skinned, small stature. The shop owner described him as... A pause, the sound of paper shifting, Price choosing his next words with visible care. And I'm reading this directly, sir. Like a cat that learned to walk, if the cat was also a bit of a prick about the vinegar. There was a long silence on the line.
Integra reached for her cigar, drew on it once, and set it back down. "Get me everything you have on both incidents on my desk in 20 minutes, she said, "and wake Walter. I want him briefed before I speak to anyone else." "Yes, sir. There's one more thing." Price hesitated, in the particular way of a man about to say something he suspects will not be well received. The 3 survivors from the warehouse, one of them, before she went unresponsive, kept repeating a specific phrase. He didn't even look angry. Over and over. The attending medic noted it specifically. "She wasn't describing an attack, sir. She was describing an inconvenience." Integra set the phone down slowly. Outside her window, London was beginning to wake into another gray morning, entirely unaware that somewhere in its streets, a god who considered fried cod a genuine highlight of his week was currently curled up asleep on the roof of a shuttered newsagent's, having decided, with the serene confidence of a being who had never once in his existence had to worry about consequences, that this seemed as good a place as any to take a nap until Whis caught up with him. Alucard felt it before anyone told him. He had been in the middle of nothing in particular, draped across the high-backed chair in his cell beneath the Hellsing estate, red eyes half-lidded, one boot resting against the wall, in that peculiar state between waking and something else that he occupied more often than he occupied anything resembling ordinary sleep, when the sensation arrived. It was not pain, it was not quite fear, though it shared fear's shape, the way a shadow shares the shape of the thing that casts it. It was, more precisely, the sensation of a predator who has spent 5 centuries believing himself to be very near the top of a particular food chain, suddenly, and without warning, being made aware that the chain extended a great deal further than he had ever previously had cause to consider. He sat up, slowly. His grin, which rarely left his face even in genuine crisis, faltered for exactly as long as it took him to place the feeling, and then returned, wider than before, edged with something that might, in a lesser creature, have been called excitement, and in Alucard was simply hunger, wearing a more honest face. "Well now," he said, to the empty cell, to no one, to the centuries of dead men whose souls swam somewhere beneath his skin and occasionally lent him their opinions whether he wanted them or not. "That's new." He didn't move immediately. There was no summons yet. Integra had not called for him, and whatever this new pressure in the air was, it hadn't yet resolved into a target he could sink his teeth into. So he simply sat, tasting it, the way a wine connoisseur might swirl an unfamiliar vintage, and let the specifics reveal themselves slowly. It was distant, still, several miles east, if his sense of it could be trusted, which it generally could, and it was vast, in a way that made the word feel almost insufficient. He had felt Millennium's captain, once, in passing, and come away from the encounter, with a healthy professional respect for how much damage a single body could survive. This was not that. This was something else entirely. Something that didn't feel like a creature so much as a fact, an immovable truth of the universe that happened, for reasons Alucard could not begin to guess at, to be currently residing in a chip shop rooftop in Wapping. His grin sharpened into something closer to a smile of genuine, uncomplicated delight. "Master's going to have quite a morning," he murmured, and settled back into his chair to wait, because 500 years of existence had taught him, if nothing else, exquisite patience for the arrival of something worth being impatient for. Walter Dornez arrived at the estate's briefing room at 7:40 a.m., silver hair immaculate despite the hour, round glasses catching the lamplight as he laid a fresh folder on the long table beside Integra's coffee, already cold. He had read Price's report on the drive over, twice, and had spent the second reading forming the particular kind of professional unease that 30 years in Hellsing service had trained him to recognize as significant. "Sir Integra," he said, taking his customary place at her right hand. "I've had our people canvass the immediate area, 2 additional witnesses, unrelated to the initial incident, corroborate the physical description. A milkman on his morning round, and a homeless gentleman who's apparently taken up semi-permanent residence in the alley behind the newsagents on Cobb Street. He set a photograph on the table, grainy, taken from a distance on a mobile phone by a witness too frightened to get closer, but clear enough. A small, cat-like figure, lavender-skinned, curled asleep on a rooftop, as though the entire city around him posed no more threat than a warm afternoon. Integra studied the photograph for a long moment. "He's sleeping, so it would appear, sir. After erasing a man from existence and paying for fish and chips with a gold ingot with no traceable origin." Integra set the photograph down with the precise, controlled motion of a woman keeping a very tight leash on her own composure. "Walter, I want your honest assessment. What are we dealing with?" Walter removed his glasses, polished them on his sleeve, a habit she'd learned over the years to recognize as him buying himself a moment to think, rather than a moment to see. "Honestly, sir, I don't know. The reports don't match anything in our records. Not Millennium's chippers, not Iscariot's usual concerns. Nothing consistent with anything we've cataloged from either the occult or the scientific side of things. The manner of the disappearance, for lack of a better word, is unlike anything in our files. No blood, no residue, no trace evidence whatsoever. It isn't consistent with any weapon we know of. It isn't consistent with any magic we know of either. It's simply an absence where a person used to be. And the survivors? 2 are being held for observation at the estate's medical wing as we speak. The 3rd discharged herself against advice and hasn't been located since. I've men looking for her, but I suspect fear rather than malice is driving that particular disappearance." Walter's mouth thinned. "The consistent detail across every account, sir, is the manner, not violence, not rage. Every witness described something closer to mild irritation, as though the entire event were beneath the notice of whoever caused it." Integra was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. In her years running Hellsing, she had faced monsters that reveled in cruelty, monsters that killed out of hunger, monsters that killed out of ideology, monsters like the one sleeping downstairs in his cell, who killed, if she was honest with herself, largely because it amused him and because she asked him to. She had never faced anything, in report or in memory, that killed the way this thing apparently had, not out of any of those reasons, but simply because a man had been rude to it, and rudeness had ceased to be worth tolerating a half-second before it ceased to be worth remembering. "Get Alucard," she said finally. "I want eyes on this before it wakes up and decides to have breakfast in a more populated part of the city." "Sir Integra." Walter hesitated, a rare enough occurrence that it made her look up. "If I may, whatever this is, I would advise a reconnaissance order, not an engagement order. Not until we understand what we're facing. We've built our reputation on knowing our enemy before we move against it. I would hate for that discipline to slip now, of all moments." Integra held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single sharp nod. "Reconnaissance only. Alucard is not to engage unless engaged first. I want to know what it is, what it wants, and most importantly, whether it can be reasoned with, before this becomes a body count." She rose, straightening her jacket, the cigar finally, decisively stubbed out. "Send him now, Walter. Before Wapping wakes up properly and gives our new friend an audience he doesn't need." Alucard received the order with the particular delight of a man handed exactly the gift he'd been hoping for, phrased in exactly the language that let him pretend he wasn't thrilled about it. "Reconnaissance," he repeated, standing now in the doorway of the briefing room, hands loose at his sides, grin stretching slow and wide beneath the brim of his hat. "Master wounds me. Here I thought you'd finally found something worth letting me off the leash for." "I've found something I don't understand," Integra said flatly, "which is precisely why the leash stays on. Look, assess, report back. If it moves against civilians, you may act to protect them, but you are not, under any circumstances, to initiate. Is that understood?"
"Perfectly, master." He tipped his hat, mockingly formal, already beginning to dissolve at the edges into shadow, the particular fraying at the corners look he took on when he intended to travel fast. Though I should mention, whatever this is, it isn't hiding, it isn't being careful. Whatever's currently napping on that rooftop either doesn't know it should be afraid of this city, or doesn't much care. His grin widened further, edged now with something almost fond, the anticipation of a man who had spent 500 years slowly running out of things capable of surprising him. I do hope it's the latter. He was gone before she could reply, not dramatically, not with the theatrical flourish he sometimes indulged in for her benefit, but simply and suddenly absent, the shadows of the briefing room folding closed over the space where he'd stood, leaving Integra alone with Walter, a cold cup of coffee, and the growing unshakable certainty that whatever London had swallowed overnight, it was about to become considerably more complicated than a gas leak. Alucard arrived on the rooftop of the shuttered newsagents in Wapping at 8:02 a.m., manifesting from shadow into the gray morning light with the fluid, unhurried ease of a creature who had never once in 5 centuries needed to rush toward danger, because danger, in his considerable experience, waited politely for him to arrive. He found Beerus exactly where the photograph had shown him, curled on the rooftop's flat tar paper surface, tail wrapped neatly around himself, magenta eyes closed, breathing with the slow, untroubled rhythm of something that had not slept this soundly in centuries and did not intend to be rushed out of it. For a long moment, Alucard simply stood there, hands in his coat pockets, studying the small sleeping figure with the frank, professional appraisal of a hunter, sizing up prey he hasn't yet decided is prey at all. He had felt powerful things before. He was, by most reasonable measures available to this world, a powerful thing, the culmination of 500 years of war, hunger, and 100,000 souls folded into one body that had made a habit of being the worst thing in whatever room it walked into. He had learned over those centuries to read power the way other men read weather, the particular pressure of it, the way it bent the air around a source strong enough to matter. The pressure coming off the small, sleeping thing in front of him did not bend the air. It simply replaced it, the way a held breath replaces the space it occupies, patient and total, and entirely unbothered by the fact that it was currently doing so on the roof of a newsagent's that sold, according to the faded sign below, discount phone cards and the Racing Post. "Well," Alucard said aloud, mostly to himself, grin widening into something closer to a baring of teeth. "Aren't you interesting?" Beerus's ear twitched. One eye opened, slowly, without alarm, the unhurried motion of a being who had simply noted a new presence in the room and decided, provisionally, that it did not yet warrant the effort of fully waking up. "You're loud," Beerus said, without lifting his head. "Go away." Alucard's grin did not falter, though something behind his red eyes sharpened with genuine, delighted surprise. 500 years, and precious few things had ever spoken to him with quite that particular flavor of bored, absolute indifference. "I've been called many things," he said, "in 5 centuries of being considerably more terrifying than the men who called me them." "Loud is new. I rather like it. Congratulations." Beerus's other eye opened. He sat up in one smooth, unhurried motion, tail curling around his feet, and regarded the tall, red-coated figure standing over him with the flat, assessing look of a customer deciding whether a menu item was worth ordering. His gaze took in the coat, the wide-brimmed glasses, the grin that had not once wavered, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted, the faint, coiled stillness of a predator recalibrating its estimate of the thing in front of it. Not fear. Beerus did not, as a rule, experience fear. But interest, genuine interest, rare enough on its own, flickered across his expression and was gone again just as quickly, folded back beneath his customary boredom. "You're not human,"
Beerus said. It wasn't a question. Neither, I gather, are you. No. Beerus rose to his feet, small and unhurried, tail flicking once behind him. I'm a god. You're... He tilted his head, studying Alucard with the particular scrutiny of a connoisseur, examining a dish he wasn't sure he trusted the ingredients of, something that used to be a man, and decided it liked being something else more. Vampire, I'm guessing, from the teeth. You people are all the same in every universe. Dramatic coats, worse manners. Alucard's grin, for the first time in longer than he could easily recall, faltered into something genuinely startled, and then, a heartbeat later, split wider than before, delighted in a way that had nothing performative left in it at all. A god, he repeated, savoring the word like a man rolling an old wine across his tongue, testing it for the lie he was certain, on principle, had to be there somewhere. He had met things that called themselves gods before. He had, on one memorable occasion several centuries prior, personally demonstrated to one such creature the considerable gap between what it called itself and what it actually was. I've heard that claim before, little cat. It rarely survives the conversation that follows it. Has it? Beerus's magenta eyes narrowed very slightly, not with anger, not yet, but with the faint, dangerous stillness of a being whose patience, while considerable, was not infinite, and whose mourning had already involved one rude interruption too many for his taste. Do you know, he said, conversationally, what happens to things that test that particular claim? I imagine, Alucard said, I'm about to find out. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fog drifted low across the rooftop between them, gray and indifferent, carrying with it the distant sound of London beginning its day. Traffic, a church bell, a dog barking somewhere several streets over, entirely unaware that the two figures standing amid the ruin of a discount newsagent's roof represented, between them, a genuine and considerable fraction of the deadliest things currently walking the surface of the earth. Then Beerus's expression shifted, not into anger, not into the cold, terminal stillness that had, less than 12 hours earlier, erased a man from existence over nothing more than a poorly aimed bullet, but into something almost like curiosity, tinged with the faint, unmistakable weariness of a being who had done this particular dance more times across more universes than he cared to count, and had, on balance, grown rather tired of it. Tell you what, Beerus said, and sat back down, cross-legged, on the rooftop, with the sudden, deflating anticlimax of a confrontation that had simply declined to happen. I'm not in the mood. I just ate. I'm still annoyed about the whole falling through a hole in the universe business, and frankly, you're the first interesting thing I've met on this dreary little rock, so I'd rather not erase you before I've at least worked out what you're doing here. He looked up at Alucard, unblinking. So, are you going to attack me, or are you going to tell me where I am, and where the other interesting one is, the woman who's apparently going to be sending more of you to stare at me before the day's out? Alucard went very still. You felt her. I felt someone give an order about 20 minutes ago, from a house that reeks of old money and older weapons, and about 6 minutes after that you showed up. Beerus shrugged, a small, cat-like roll of one shoulder. I'm not stupid. Someone's watching. Someone sent you to look at me and decide whether I'm worth being afraid of. His eyes glinted, magenta and utterly unbothered. So go on then. Look, decide, and then go tell her. He paused, tail flicking, the faintest curl of something that might, on anyone else, have been called amusement. That if she wants to talk to a god properly, she should probably learn some manners about it first. Alucard did not report back immediately. He stood on that rooftop for the better part of 20 minutes after Beerus had said his piece and gone quiet again, tail flicking with the idle rhythm of something that had already grown bored of the conversation, magenta eyes half-lidded against the gray morning light. He did not attack. He did not, despite every instinct honed over 5 centuries of being the most dangerous thing in any given room, even really consider it. not because Integra's order held him back, though it did, but because some older, colder part of him, the part that had survived 500 years by knowing precisely when a fight was worth having, was telling him with total and unambiguous clarity that this was not one of those times.
It was, he reflected, an entirely unfamiliar sensation. He turned it over the way a man turns over a coin he isn't sure is counterfeit. "You're staring," Beerus observed, without opening his eyes. "I'm appreciating." Alucard's grin had settled into something quieter now, less performative, the expression of a man doing genuine arithmetic behind his eyes. "It isn't often I meet something my instincts tell me not to provoke. I find I rather enjoy the novelty." "Your instincts," Beerus said, "are correct. You should listen to them more." He cracked one eye open, magenta and unreadable. "Go tell your mistress what you found. I'll be here. I'm not in any particular hurry to go anywhere, and this roof has a rather good view, all things considered." Alucard inclined his head, an actual bow, small and precise, the first genuine gesture of respect Integra had ever known him to offer anything that wasn't her directly, and dissolved back into shadow, leaving the god alone once more, with the fog and the distant sound of a city that had no idea yet what had settled onto one of its rooftops. He reappeared in the briefing room without ceremony, the shadows peeling back from his shoulders as he straightened, and for a moment he said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, more alarming to Integra than anything he might have said. "Well?" she demanded. "He's real," Alucard said. "Whatever he is, whatever he claims to be, he's real, Master, and I would very strongly advise against testing that claim with force." He crossed to the window, looked out at the gray city beyond it, and for once his grin carried no theater in it at all. "I've fought demons wearing the skin of gods before. False things, borrowed titles, power stolen and worn like a costume. I know what that feels like. This isn't that." He turned back to her. "This is the genuine article. I could feel it, standing 6 feet from him, the same way you feel the edge of a cliff before you've looked down." Something in me, 500 years old and not easily impressed, took one look at him and decided, immediately, that this was not a fight I wanted. "Pretty much right away. Well, I've always had a little. Comes with the job, I guess. Computer sales." He crossed to the table, hands braced against it, red eyes intent. "He erased a man last night, Master. Not killed, erased. No blood, no body, nothing left behind at all, over a single poorly aimed bullet that didn't even scratch him. And this morning, when I stood in front of him, ready for whatever he intended to do about my presence, he simply lost interest, sat back down, told me to fetch you, and to bring better manners next time. A short, disbelieving laugh. I have not been dismissed like that since I was still drawing breath the ordinary way, Master. 5 centuries, and a creature the size of a large house cat just sent me home like an errand boy." Walter, who had been listening from his position near the door with the careful stillness of a man absorbing information he intended to act on rather than react to, spoke for the first time. "Did he give a name?" "Beerus," Alucard said. "He calls himself a god of destruction. And Walter," the grin returned, but thin now, edged with something almost like respect. "I am rather inclined to believe him." Integra was quiet for a long moment, turning the word over. God of destruction. Not a demon's boast, not a freak's delusion of grandeur, not even the particular self-mythologizing that certain older vampires indulged in when they'd survived long enough to start believing their own legend. Alucard did not use that particular tone of voice, careful, weighing, genuinely uncertain, for anything that wasn't real. "What does he want?" she asked finally. "He says he wants to know where he is." And he made mention of another, an attendant, I gathered, someone who was traveling with him before whatever brought him here separated them. He didn't seem particularly worried about it, more inconvenienced. Alucard straightened, hands sliding back into his coat pockets. He also said, quite specifically, that if you wanted to talk to a god properly, you should learn some manners about it first. Despite herself, despite the gravity of everything Alucard had just told her, the corner of Integra's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Walter noticed it and filed the observation away for later. "Did he?" she said flatly. "His exact words, Master. I thought it best not to embellish." Integra rose from her chair, moved to the window, and looked out at the gray sprawl of the city beyond it. The city she had spent years learning to protect from monsters that wore recognizable shapes, that could be cataloged and studied, and eventually killed if killing became necessary. This was something else. This was a category of problem the Round Table had never once had to draft contingencies for, because no one, in the entire history of the Hellsing organization, had ever imagined they might one day need a policy for the arrival of an actual god. "Walter," she said, without turning around, "get me everything Iscariot has on record concerning divine entities. Anything from their theological archives that isn't pure doctrine. Anything with an operational precedent. If the Vatican has ever had to think seriously about what happens when God stops being a metaphor, I want to know what they concluded." She paused. "And prepare a car. If Alucard is right, if this thing genuinely cannot be threatened, cannot be contained, and cannot be reasoned with through force, then I am not going to send my people to test that theory a second time. I'm going to go talk to it myself, Sir Integra." Walter's voice carried the particular weight of a man choosing his objection with great care. "With respect, if Alucard, of all people, considers this too dangerous to provoke, I would ask you to reconsider walking into that danger personally." "I'm not planning to provoke it, Walter." Integra turned from the window, and there was something in her expression now. Not fear, never quite fear, but the focused, deliberate calm of a woman who had spent her entire adult life making exactly this kind of decision and had learned, through hard experience, which risks were worth taking. "I'm planning to do the one thing nobody in this city has apparently thought to try yet. I'm going to be polite to it." Wyss found the tear in the fabric of causality not quite where he expected it, though he supposed on reflection that expected was a strange word to apply to a passage that shouldn't have been able to exist in the first place. It hung in the void between worlds like a wound that hadn't finished healing, ragged at the edges, pulsing faintly with residual magic so foreign to his own understanding of reality that he found himself, for the first time in several millennia, genuinely intrigued rather than simply patient. He studied it for some time before stepping through, not out of caution for his own safety, which was never in serious question, but out of the particular professional thoroughness of a being whose entire purpose was to understand things before acting on them, a discipline his employer had never once managed to fully absorb, despite Wyss's centuries of gentle modeling. The magic, he concluded eventually, was old, genuinely old, layered thick with the residue of a working that had been attempted by mortals who understood perhaps a tenth of what they were reaching for. There was something almost tragic in it, the way a child's crude drawing of a door could, under exactly the wrong circumstances, briefly become a real one. It would not hold. It was already beginning to knit itself closed, the raw edges of it drawing inward the way a wound scabs over, and Wyss noted with mild interest that whatever world lay on the other side had apparently generated enough ambient magical noise of its own. Old blood, old rituals, centuries of accumulated occult violence, that the tear had found purchase here in a way it likely couldn't have anywhere else. A world already halfway convinced that monsters were real had made it that much easier for something monstrous, in the loosest and most magnificent sense of the word, to arrive. "Curious," Wyss murmured, and stepped through. He arrived not on the rooftop where Beerus waited. The passage delivered him, with the mild imprecision typical of unstable, mortal-forged doorways, some several miles distant, in the quiet, fog-wrapped grounds of a large estate whose iron gates and old stone walls carried the particular weight of a place that had seen a great deal of violence and gone to considerable lengths to keep that fact hidden from casual observers. He found himself, in fact, standing on the gravel drive of the Hellsing estate itself,
not 30 feet from where a car was being brought around for Sir Integra Hellsing's departure, staff in hand, robes entirely unruffled by a journey that would have killed most mortal travelers several times over. The response from the estate staff was immediate, and, to Wyss's mild amusement, almost comically proportionate. Several armed men emerging from the tree line with weapons raised shouted commands to identify himself, the crunch of gravel underfoot as a security detail closed in with the brisk, professional efficiency of an organization that had drilled for exactly this sort of unexpected arrival more times than its members would have liked. Wyss regarded them all with the calm, faintly delighted expression of a man who had just discovered, quite by accident, that this particular world's monster hunters had considerably better reflexes than most. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, to the nearest rifle barrel. "I don't suppose any of you have seen a small, purple, extremely hungry god pass this way recently. He tends to leave quite an impression." There was a brief, startled silence, broken only by the click of a car door, as Integra Hellsing, halfway into the vehicle that was meant to carry her toward exactly the confrontation this stranger was casually inquiring about, went very still and turned. For a long moment nobody moved. Integra stood half in and half out of the car, one hand still on the door frame, the morning fog curling pale around her ankles, and studied the man who had just appeared, apparently from nowhere, on her own front drive, asking after a god with the casual tone of someone inquiring whether a delivery had arrived on schedule. He did not look dangerous, in the way she had learned to recognize danger. No weapon in evidence beyond the slender staff resting against his shoulder, no aggressive posture, nothing in his bearing that suggested a threat assessment her security details training had prepared them for. And yet, every instinct she'd sharpened across a decade of leading Hellsing told her, with the same cold clarity Alucard's report had carried an hour before, that the 6 armed men currently surrounding this stranger represented, in any conflict that might actually occur, considerably less resistance than they believed themselves to. "Lower your weapons," she said. Her security chief hesitated, rifle still trained on the newcomer. "Sir Integra," I said, "lower them." She stepped fully out of the car, closing the door behind her, and crossed the gravel drive with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a woman who had decided, in the span of about 2 seconds, that whatever this encounter was going to be, it would not begin with her flinching first. "You're looking for Beerus." Wyss's expression brightened with genuine, uncomplicated pleasure. "You know him already. How efficient." He inclined his head in a small, courteous bow, staff shifting to rest properly against his shoulder now that the rifles had, reluctantly, lowered. "Wyss, I have the somewhat demanding privilege of serving as Lord Beerus's attendant, martial arts instructor, and, on mornings such as this one, his search party. You wouldn't happen to know where he's gotten to. A rooftop in Wapping, as of an hour ago, eating fish apparently, and being condescending to my vampire." Integra studied him a moment longer, weighing the strange calm of him, the sense, familiar now, twice in one morning, of standing near something whose true scale she could only guess at. "I was about to go speak with him myself. You're welcome to join me, Mr. Wyss, on the condition that you answer some questions on the way." "That seems an entirely fair exchange." Wyss's golden eyes glinted with something like approval. "You're considerably calmer about this than most beings I've met under similar circumstances, if I may say so. Most civilizations tend toward panic, or worship, or some unfortunate combination of the two." "I run an organization that exists to manage things London would rather not know are real," Integra said, opening the car door once more, gesturing him toward it with a curtness that was, for her, almost warm. "Panic isn't useful to me. Understanding is. So, while we drive, Mr. Wyss, you're going to help me understand exactly what I invited into my city last night."
The drive to Wapping took the better part of 40 minutes through London's slow-waking morning traffic, and Integra spent every one of them extracting from Wyss, with the patient, methodical precision of a woman accustomed to interrogating far less willing subjects, a working understanding of precisely what, and who, her organization was now dealing with.
She learned of universes, plural, numbered rather than named, each overseen by its own god of destruction and accompanying angelic attendant, a cosmic balance maintained across scales that made her own concerns about Millennium's chipper program feel, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely small. She learned that Beerus's role was not malice, precisely, nor even conquest, but a kind of cosmic pruning, the removal of civilizations, planets, entire stretches of existence that had grown, in his estimation, too dangerous or too stagnant to be allowed to continue. She learned that he had erased galaxies with less thought than most men gave to swatting a fly, and that he did so rarely, and almost always reluctantly, because destruction on that scale bored him nearly as much as it terrified everyone else. She learned, most usefully, that he could be reasoned with, that beneath the boredom and the casual, cosmic scale threat of him, there existed something startlingly close to a code, an aristocratic and deeply particular sense of what was and was not worth his attention, and that the single most reliable way to survive an encounter with Beerus was, according to Wyss, delivered with the faint, fond amusement of a man who had spent centuries managing exactly this problem, to be interesting, be polite, and under absolutely no circumstances waste his time. "And if we fail at any of those three things?" Integra asked. "Then I would recommend," Wyss said pleasantly, "having your affairs in considerable order beforehand." By the time the car pulled to a stop at the edge of the cordoned-off warehouse district, Integra had revised her mental model of London's threat landscape twice over, and had arrived, with the particular cold clarity that had carried her through every crisis of her tenure so far, at a working conclusion. This was not a monster to be hunted. This was a force of nature that had, through nothing more than bad luck and a poorly executed occult ritual, wandered into her jurisdiction, and the only sane strategy available to her was the one she had already committed to before she'd even known his name. Manage him, understand him, and above all, do not give him a reason to stop finding London interesting. They found Beerus exactly where Alucard had left him, though his posture had shifted from sleeping to something closer to idle, cross-legged on the newsagent's rooftop, watching the street below with the mild, incurious attention of a tourist who had, against his own expectations, started to find the local wildlife mildly diverting. "Wyss," he said, without looking up, the moment the two of them came into view on the street below. "You took your time." "The passage was somewhat unconventional, my lord," Wyss said, rising effortlessly to the rooftop, in a single unhurried step that defied, without comment or apparent effort, every law of physics the watching security detail understood. "I had to determine the safest route before following. I trust you haven't destroyed anything important in the meantime. One building, one man. It was very minor, as these things go." Beerus's tail flicked. "The food here is surprisingly good, though. Fried, in batter, you'd like it." "I shall take your word for it." Wyss's gaze shifted, briefly, down to where Integra stood on the street, arms folded, watching the exchange with the careful, assessing patience of a woman gathering every scrap of intelligence the moment offered. "My lord, I believe our host would like a word." Beerus followed his gaze, and for the first time his full attention settled on Integra Hellsing, magenta eyes taking her in, unhurried, the same flat, appraising study he'd given Alucard an hour before. Something in his expression shifted, very slightly, the boredom receding by a fraction to make room for genuine curiosity. "You're the one who sent the vampire," he said. "I am." Integra did not look away, did not flinch under the weight of a gaze that she was now fully, consciously aware,
belonged to something capable of erasing her entire city without particular effort. Integra Hellsing.
I run the organization responsible for protecting London from threats it doesn't know exist. She let that settle for a moment before continuing, her voice level, deliberately without deference and equally deliberately without challenge. I understand you didn't choose to be here. I understand this isn't your world, and that you'd rather not be inconvenienced by it any longer than necessary. I'd like to help with that, if you're willing to talk, rather than simply be watched. For a long moment, Beerus said nothing, studying her with the particular stillness that had, 12 hours earlier, preceded a man's total erasure from existence. Integra held her ground, chin level, hands loose at her sides, betraying nothing of the very real understanding that this entire conversation could end, at any moment, for reasons she might never fully understand. Then Beerus smiled, a small, thin, genuinely pleased expression, the first she'd seen from him. "Well," he said, glancing sideways at Whis, "this one has manners." He rose, unhurried, tail curling behind him, and looked back down at Integra with something that had shifted, unmistakably, from mere tolerance into something closer to interest. "Fine, talk. But I warn you now, I've already decided this city has good food, an entertaining vampire, and apparently at least one human clever enough not to point a gun at me. That's 3 points in its favor already. It'll take considerable effort on your part to lose my interest from here." Integra allowed herself, for the first time since Price's phone call that morning, the smallest possible measure of relief. "I'll do my best not to waste it then," she said. "Shall we discuss this somewhere with better tea than a rooftop can offer?" 300 miles south, in a converted cathedral basement that housed Section I's London operations, Enrico Maxwell set down a secure telephone and stood very still for several seconds, his expression caught somewhere between fascination and outrage. "Say that again," he said to the priest who had delivered the report. "A presence, Your Eminence. Detected across 3 separate consecration sites in East London overnight. Sensors, calibrated to register significant supernatural disturbance, all 3 registering readings that exceed anything we've recorded. Including," the priest hesitated, glancing down at his notes as though hoping they might have changed since he last read them, "including anything logged during the Battle of London contingency drills. This isn't Millennium. It isn't Hellsing's monster. Whatever triggered these readings doesn't match any signature in Vatican archive." Maxwell's jaw tightened. He turned toward the window of his office, looking out over a London he had spent years believing he understood the true, hidden shape of: heretics and monsters, Protestant and Catholic, the Round Table's godless pragmatism against Iscariot's righteous purpose, a war he had fought on those terms for the whole of his adult life. "Find out what it is," he said, "and find out before Hellsing decides it's theirs to keep quiet about." His eyes narrowed. "Something that powerful, in this city, unaccounted for, that is not a coincidence Section X Minai can afford to sit on. Not while there is still a war to win. And further still, aboard a vessel drifting somewhere over the North Sea, disguised in the hold of a container ship whose paperwork listed cargo that did not remotely resemble what it actually carried, a small blonde figure sat cross-legged on a steel catwalk, ears twitching, tail curling with sudden startled attention. "Major," Schrödinger said, tilting his head as though listening to something no one else in the room could hear. "Something new just happened in London. Something big." The Major, vast and genial in his ornate coat, looked up slowly from the maps spread across his table, a smile spreading beneath his mustache, the particular delighted smile of a man who had spent his entire existence hungry for exactly this kind of surprise. "Big," he repeated, savoring the word. "How wonderfully, wonderfully inconvenient. Do tell me more, little one." Integra's study had entertained a great many strange conversations over the years, briefings on freak outbreaks, negotiations with the Vatican's more reasonable representatives,
the occasional midnight audience with a vampire who found her furniture more interesting than the crisis at hand. It had never, until this particular gray Tuesday morning, hosted a god. Beerus sat in the high-backed chair opposite her desk with the loose, unbothered posture of a creature entirely unimpressed by the room's careful weight of old leather and older weapons, tail curled across his lap, magenta eyes drifting occasionally toward the mounted relics on the far wall, with the mild curiosity of a man browsing a shop he had no intention of buying from. Whis stood a step behind him, hands folded over his staff, radiating the calm, watchful patience of a chaperone who had done this exact dance on 100 worlds and expected, on some level, to do it on 100 more. Walter had brought tea. Beerus had regarded the cup with deep suspicion for a full 10 seconds before deciding it was acceptable, and was now, Integra noted with something approaching disbelief, drinking it with genuine enjoyment. So, she said, once the ritual of pouring and settling had passed, and there was no further reason to delay the conversation both of them had, in their own ways, been circling. You didn't choose to come here, no. Beerus set the cup down with more care than she'd expected from him. Whis was taking me to dinner. Somewhere quiet. I'd had quite enough of Earth's usual noise for 1 week. Something reached into the passage between worlds and pulled. Crude. Desperate. The sort of working immortal attempts when they've found a door they don't understand and decided the correct response is to yank on the handle as hard as possible. His tail flicked, the faint irritation of the memory still fresh. It worked, unfortunately for everyone involved. Myself included. A ritual, Integra said slowly, performed by a Millennium cell operating out of a warehouse in Wapping. If that's the name of the desperate little men in the basement, then yes. Beerus's eyes narrowed slightly. There was an artifact. Something old, layered with a great deal of half-understood magic, cannibalized from several traditions that clearly weren't meant to be combined. It's what let the pull find purchase in the first place. Whis tells me your world already carries an unusual amount of what he calls ambient occult noise. Vampires. Rituals. Centuries of people reaching for doors they had no business opening. Apparently that made the crude little hook they built considerably more effective than it had any right to be. Integra absorbed that in silence for a moment, turning it over with the same careful precision she applied to every piece of intelligence that crossed her desk. Millennium, already responsible for freak chippers flooding London's streets, already the single greatest threat to Hellsing's mandate in a generation, had, apparently by accident, reached into the fabric of reality itself and dragged out something that made every soldier in the Letztes Bataillon look, by comparison, like a rounding error. Do you know, she said carefully, whether the artifact survived the ritual, whether it's repeatable? Beerus glanced sideways at Whis, who inclined his head thoughtfully. A fair question, and an important one, Whis said. The passage has already begun closing on its own. These things tend to, once the initial strain releases. But if the artifact that opened it remains intact, and if whoever built the ritual understood even a fraction of what they'd stumbled onto, there's no reason to assume they couldn't attempt it again. Cruder magic has a way of being reused precisely because its practitioners rarely grasp how dangerous it truly is. Integra's jaw tightened. So, it's possible Millennium could pull something else through. Something worse. It's possible, Whis agreed, with the mild, unhurried tone of a man delivering genuinely alarming news the way one might mention rain in the forecast. Though I should say, my lord's presence here was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary accident. The odds of anything comparable being dragged through twice are vanishingly small. I would be more concerned, if I were you, about what your Millennium cell intended to summon in the first place. Working built to pull, rather than invite, suggests they weren't hoping for something as, cooperative as my lord happened to be. I am not cooperative, Beerus said, with the flat, wounded dignity of a man correcting a minor but important slight. I am reasonable, when reasonable people are involved. There's a difference. Of course, my lord. Integra let the exchange pass without comment, filing away the dynamic between them. The deference, the fondness beneath it, the sense that whatever Beerus was in the wider scope of his own universe, Whis had spent a very long time learning precisely how to manage him without ever once diminishing him.
It told her something useful. Gods, apparently, could be managed. They simply required a very particular kind of care. I want to find the artifact, she said, and whoever's left of the cell that used it. If there's any chance Millennium repeats this, I need to know how, and I need to shut it down before it happens. She met Beerus's eyes directly. I'd like your help doing that, not because I expect you to fight my war for me. I understand that isn't your concern, and I won't pretend otherwise. But you have a stake in this too. Whoever pulled you here did it once. I doubt either of us wants to find out what happens if they manage it a second time, with less luck involved. Beerus considered her for a long moment, tail tapping once against the arm of the chair. You're not asking me to destroy your enemies for you. No, most people in your position would. Most people in my position, Integra said, haven't yet worked out that a god who does something for you out of obligation is a god who stops finding you interesting the moment the obligation's fulfilled. I'd rather you stayed curious. A thin, deliberate note of dry humor entered her voice, a calculated risk, offered with the same careful precision she brought to everything else in the room. Besides, you said this city had good food and an entertaining vampire. I imagine chasing down the fools who dragged you here against your will falls somewhere in that same category. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Beerus laughed, a short, genuinely delighted bark of sound, sharp and surprised, the first unguarded reaction she'd drawn from him since he'd sat down. Whis, he said, still grinning. I like her. So I gathered, my lord, Whis said, with the faint, satisfied warmth of a man whose careful education in diplomacy had, once again, proven its worth. Shall I take it we're assisting, then? We're observing, Beerus said, settling back into his chair with the air of a man who had, despite his own correction, already made up his mind. Closely, with the option to get involved if it turns out to be entertaining. He looked back at Integra, magenta eyes glinting. Find your desperate little cultists. Find your artifact. I'll be around. And Integra Hellsing. The faint edge of warning beneath the words was unmistakable, even wrapped in his lazy drawl. If this turns out to be boring, or if your people waste any more of my time with poorly aimed bullets, I reserve the right to lose interest very quickly. Understood? Understood, Integra said, and extended a hand across the desk. The same gesture she'd have offered any ally worth the courtesy, extended now to a being who could, with a single idle motion, remove her, her estate, and everything within several miles of it from existence, without breaking a sweat. Beerus looked at the offered hand for a moment, faintly bemused, and then shook it. His grip, she noted, was gentle, deliberately so, the careful restraint of something enormous learning, in real time, exactly how much of itself it could safely extend toward something so breakable. There, he said. Now, about that tea, is there more? The report reached the Major within the hour, relayed up a chain of increasingly nervous subordinates until it landed, finally, on the desk of the one man aboard the drifting vessel, who greeted bad news the way other men greeted an unexpected gift. So, the Major said, steepling his gloved fingers, our clever little cell in Wapping, the one testing Doctor's fragment of the Carpathian relic, appears to have succeeded beyond its wildest, most idiotic imaginings, and then promptly gotten 3/4 of itself erased for the privilege. He chuckled, low and delighted, the sound echoing off the steel walls of the hold. A god, Schrödinger, not a demon wearing the word as a costume, an actual, honest-to-whatever passes for God in this godless century deity, dropped directly into Hellsing's lap, and already, if my sources within the Round Table's own communications are to be believed, taking tea with Sir Integra herself. Are we going to go say hello, Major?
Schrödinger asked, tail flicking, ears pricked with genuine excitement. Not yet, little one. Not yet. The Major's smile widened beneath his mustache, eyes bright with the particular hunger of a man who had spent a lifetime designing better and better wars, only to be handed, without warning, a variable no war college on Earth could ever have prepared him for.
First, we learn everything we possibly can. What does it want? What does it fear, if anything? Does it bleed? Does it even have blood to spill? He rose from his chair, moving to the map spread across the table. London streets marked with 100 careful annotations of troop movement and supply lines that suddenly felt, to a man of his intelligence, almost quaintly insufficient. The doctor's relic pulled it through by accident. Imagine, Schrödinger, what we might pull through deliberately once we understand how the trick was done. His laugh rose, delighted and terrible, filling the hold. Hellsing thinks it's found a new ally. What it's actually found, my dear boy, is the key to a door none of us knew existed, and I intend to be the one who learns to use it properly. The warehouse district in Wapping, by mid-afternoon, had become a peculiar kind of crime scene, cordoned off by Helsing's own people rather than the Metropolitan Police, who had been quietly informed that the incident fell under special jurisdiction and had, with the practiced incuriosity of officers who'd learned not to ask questions about that particular phrase, withdrawn without complaint. Sarah's Victoria arrived a little after 2, dispatched by Integra with orders that had struck her, reading them over twice in the back of the transport van, as almost absurdly understated given what she now understood to be waiting for her at the scene. Secure the site. Document everything. Do not, under any circumstances, engage the entity if he is still present. As though the entity were a stray dog that might wander back through if she wasn't careful, rather than, if half of what Alucard had reportedly said was true, something capable of erasing the entire city block she was currently standing in, without noticing it had done so. "You're new," a voice said, from somewhere above her. Saris looked up sharply, cannon already half raised on instinct, and found Beerus perched, cross-legged, on the sagging remains of the warehouse's second floor, watching her with the same flat, unhurried curiosity he seemed to bring to everything. Yes, sort of." She lowered the weapon, though every instinct screamed at her not to, and forced her voice level. "Sarah's Victoria, Hellsing. I'm here to look over the site. I know who you are. The vampire told me about you." Beerus tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her distinctly uncomfortable, though not, she noted, with some surprise, with the particular dread she'd have expected. It was more like being examined by something that had simply never encountered her specific type of creature before and was cataloging the differences with mild academic interest. "You're newer than he is, softer. You don't wear what you are the way he does." Saris hesitated, unsure whether that was an insult, an observation, or something else entirely. "I suppose I'm still getting used to it." "Good." Beerus's tail flicked. "Don't rush it." He rushed nothing. Over 500 years. And look how insufferable he turned out. A faint, almost fond note colored the words, the closest thing to approval she'd yet heard from him regarding her sire. "You, at least, still flinch at things. That's not weakness. That's just not being finished yet." Saris wasn't entirely sure how to respond to being appraised, mid-crime scene, by a god who apparently found her unfinished vampirism more interesting than concerning. She settled, in the end, for simply getting on with her job, moving through the ruined basement with her torch raised, documenting the scorch marks around the chalk circle, the shattered remains of Millennium's improvised laboratory, the strange, cold absence where the ritual's focal point had clearly once stood. It was there, kneeling by the circle's outer edge, that she found it, a fragment no larger than her palm, of something that had clearly once been part of a larger whole. Dark, almost black stone, veined with a faint, sickly green light that pulsed with slow, arrhythmic patience, warm to the touch,
in a way that had nothing to do with temperature.
She said, "I think I found something." Beerus was beside her before she'd finished the sentence. Not walking, not any motion she'd actually perceived, simply there, crouched at her shoulder, studying the fragment with an expression that had shifted, abruptly, from idle curiosity into something considerably sharper. "That's a piece of it," he said. "The artifact, whatever pulled me through." His eyes narrowed, magenta and intent. "It's still active. Barely. Most of whatever power it had is spent, but it's not dead. Someone left in a hurry and didn't bother to make sure it was properly finished." He reached out one clawed finger, hovering an inch above the fragment without quite touching it, and something in the air around them shifted, subtle and cold. "Interesting. It's not just occult junk stitched together by amateurs. There's something genuinely old woven into this. Older than anything your Millennium people could have built themselves." A pause. "I'd very much like to know where they got it." "There were survivors," Saris offered. "3 of them, from the report. They're being held at the estate." Beerus's expression sharpened further, the boredom falling away entirely now, replaced by something focused and almost eager. "Then let's go ask them," he said, straightening, "before your organization's usual approach to interrogation puts them somewhere I can't." The 3 survivors of the whopping cell, the shaved-head man's terrified companions from the night before, still catatonic when brought in but slowly, over the course of the day, returning to something resembling coherence under careful handling, had been installed in a secure wing of the estate's medical facility, watched over by a pair of guards who had drawn the assignment with visible reluctance, once word spread of what, exactly, had put them in this condition. Walter met Beerus and Saris at the wing's entrance with the particular calm efficiency he brought to every crisis, though even his composure flickered, briefly, at the sight of the god falling into step beside them, as though he had every right in the world to conduct a Hellsing interrogation personally, which, Walter reflected, he likely did, given that no one in the building possessed the means to argue the point. "They've been cooperative," Walter said, leading the way down the corridor. "Frightened, understandably, but cooperative. We've gotten a partial account. The cell was small, low-level Millennium sympathizers rather than trained operatives, working from instructions they didn't fully understand, using a relic supplied to them through channels they claim not to have had full visibility into." "Claim," Beerus repeated. "Claim," Walter agreed. "I'd take it with some skepticism, but for what it's worth, sir, if I may call you that, my read of them is genuine ignorance, rather than deliberate concealment. They were given a piece of something and told what symbols to draw. I doubt any of them understood what door they were actually trying to open." Beerus made a small, considering sound and said nothing further until they reached the thin woman with the clipboard, no longer clutching it, now, but sitting hunched on the edge of a cot, hollow-eyed, flinching visibly the moment the god stepped into the room. "You," Beerus said, without preamble, crouching to bring himself roughly level with her. "You told me where the food was last night. I appreciated that. It's the only reason I'm going to ask you nicely, instead of simply taking the answer out of your head, which I could do, though I find it distasteful, and generally more trouble than it's worth." His voice remained level, almost gentle, which somehow made it considerably more frightening than a threat delivered with heat would have been. "Where did your people get the relic?" The woman's hands trembled, but she answered, quickly, the words tumbling out with the particular desperate honesty of someone who had already watched exactly what happened to people who didn't. It wasn't ours originally. It came down from a contact in the organization, higher up. We were told it was recovered from a dig, somewhere in the Carpathians, years ago, that it had been sitting in storage until someone decided it might be useful for the chipper program. We were never told who authorized sending it to us, just that it had already been tested once before, somewhere else, and that it hadn't worked properly that time either. Beerus went very still. "Tested," he repeated, "somewhere else. That's what we were told, sir. I don't know where, I don't know when. The woman's voice cracked. We were just supposed to finish what the first attempt started. Whoever tried before us apparently didn't have the right components. We were given additional pieces, told to complete the circle properly this time.
Beerus rose slowly, expression unreadable, and turned to look at Walter and Saris with something in his eyes that neither of them had yet seen from him. Not the flat boredom, not the sharp, dangerous stillness of the night before, but genuine, focused concern, the first time he had appeared, in any sense, less than entirely in control of the situation.
"Whis," he said, without raising his voice, and the attendant appeared beside him within the span of a single heartbeat, having apparently been listening from somewhere just beyond the door. This wasn't a one-time accident. "No, my lord," Whis said quietly, gold eyes grave. "It rather sounds as though it wasn't. Someone's been experimenting with this relic before now, learning from failed attempts, refining the working." Beerus's tail lashed once, sharp and controlled. "Which means whoever's running your Millennium's higher ranks, Integra Hellsing, isn't just responsible for accidentally dragging a god through a hole in the universe." His eyes, when he looked back at Walter, had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the particular fury of a being who had just realized, for the first time since his arrival, that he might not be the only surprise this ritual had ever produced, or the last. "They've been trying to open this door on purpose," Beerus said, "and I'd very much like to know what, or who, they were actually hoping would walk through it."
The Major received the transcript of the interrogation less than 6 hours after it occurred, a testament, Integra would later reflect with grim professional respect, to just how thoroughly Millennium had infiltrated the lower rungs of her own intelligence network, a leak she now had to assume had existed for months rather than days.
He read it twice, seated in his private cabin aboard the drifting vessel, the doctor hovering at his shoulder with the perpetually anxious energy of a man whose life's work had just been exposed as considerably more dangerous than even he had intended. "They weren't supposed to talk," the doctor said, wringing his hands. "The cell was meant to be entirely self-contained, Major, I assured you. And they were self-contained until a god tore their basement open and started asking questions in person," the Major said pleasantly, setting the transcript down. "I don't fault them for talking, Doctor. I'd have talked too, in their position. What concerns me rather more is that our lavender-skinned friend now knows this wasn't his first brush with our little door." He steepled his fingers, smile widening beneath his mustache. "Tell me, honestly, how many attempts before whopping?" "3. The doctor's voice was tight. "2 failures. Nothing came through at all. The relic simply burned itself out. And 1, Major, the 3rd attempt, 18 months ago, in the Ardennes facility. Something did come through. Briefly. We lost containment within minutes. Whatever it was, killed 11 researchers before the passage sealed itself again. We never identified what it had been. There was nothing left to identify." The Major was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost none of its warmth, though something colder moved beneath it now. 11 researchers, and you didn't think to mention this to me at the time. I reported it as an experimental failure, Major. I didn't know. The doctor's hands twisted together. I didn't understand what we'd actually been reaching toward. I still don't. Not fully. The relic doesn't open a door to anywhere specific. It reaches, blindly, into somewhere else, and pulls back whatever happens to be near enough, powerful enough, to answer the pull. Ardennes pulled something that killed 11 men in minutes. Wapping pulled a god who erased 1 man out of mild irritation and then went looking for lunch. His voice cracked with something close to hysterical laughter. There is no controlling what answers, Major. There never was. We have been knocking on a door that opens onto the entire unknowable depth of everything, and hoping, each time, that whatever notices us happens to be useful. The Major considered this with the calm, delighted patience of a man who had just been handed a puzzle box considerably more interesting than the one he'd started the day with.
Then we refine our aim, he said simply. You said the relic reaches blindly, Doctor. I don't believe that for a moment, not entirely. Something pulled a god of destruction from wherever gods of destruction naturally reside, and something else, 18 months prior, pulled whatever horror tore through 11 men in the Ardennes. There is a pattern buried in that blindness, even if you haven't found it yet. Power answers power, does it not? The relic reached for something strong. We simply haven't yet learned to reach for something strong and controllable at the same time. He rose, moving to the window, looking out over the gray churn of the North Sea, with the particular hunger of a man already 3 steps ahead of the conversation he was having. Rebuild the array. Recover whatever remains of the original relic. I understand our god of destruction may have taken an interest in the fragment Wapping left behind, so we shall need to be resourceful about that. And Doctor, he glanced back, smiled terrible and genuine at once. Find me everything you can about why it chose him. Not luck, not accident. I want to know the mechanism. Because if we can learn to aim this door even slightly better than blind hope, imagine, Doctor, what an army of Beerus's kind, properly commanded, might accomplish for the glory of the fatherland. The doctor said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to a man who had just, in the space of a single conversation, decided to weaponize the concept of a god. Integra received word of the 18-month-old Ardennes incident by nightfall, relayed through a source inside what remained of Millennium's fractured European network, a defector, low-level and terrified, who had traded the information for the promise of protection Integra fully intended to honor, if only because she suspected she would need every source willing to talk before this was over. She read the report twice in her study, the same room that had, 12 hours earlier, hosted tea with a god, and felt something in her chest tighten with the particular cold clarity of a commander realizing the shape of a war she hadn't fully understood she was already fighting. 11 dead, she said, when Alucard materialized from the shadows behind her desk, drawn by nothing more than her own quiet, focused fury. 18 months ago, something came through, killed them all within minutes, and vanished again before anyone got a proper look at it. She set the report down. Millennium's been trying this before. Beerus wasn't the first thing they pulled through. He's simply the first thing that survived long enough to be interviewed about it. Alucard's grin, for once, carried no humor in it at all. And now they know it works. Now they know it works, and they're refining it. Integra rose, moving to the window. London's lights spread out gray and indifferent below her. Walters already confirmed it. Beerus and Weiss both believe the relic can be repaired, rebuilt, used again. Which means somewhere out there, the Major is sitting on a doorway into the unknown, and he's just been handed proof that the thing on the other side of it might occasionally hand him a weapon beyond anything Millennium's chipper program could ever produce. You're worried he'll try again. I'm worried he'll succeed. Integra's jaw set hard. Beerus came through by accident, and he's reasonable so far, more reasonable than I had any right to expect. But the Ardennes thing killed 11 men in minutes and left nothing behind to identify. What happens if the Major manages to pull through something with that kind of power, and none of Beerus's restraint? She turned back to face him, the full weight of command settling across her features. We can't wait for that answer. We find Millennium's remaining fragment of the relic, and whatever facility they're using to rebuild it, and we shut it down, permanently, before they get a second working attempt off the ground. Alucard's grin returned, slow and sharp, edged now with the particular anticipation he reserved for the promise of a genuine fight. Now that, he said, sounds considerably more like my kind of reconnaissance, Master. Beerus, informed of the Ardennes incident over a late dinner Weiss had, with characteristic patience, conjured from ingredients gathered across 3 separate continents in the time it took Integra to finish briefing them, set down his chopsticks with unusual deliberateness. 11 men, he repeated, killed within minutes, and nothing left behind to identify what did it. That's the report, my lord, Weiss confirmed.
Beerus was quiet for a long moment, turning that over with an intensity that made the temperature in the room drop by some small, imperceptible fraction. Not rage, not yet, but the cold, focused attention of a being recalculating exactly how seriously he needed to take a situation he'd initially filed, mentally, under mild inconvenience. "I don't like this," he said finally. "Not because I'm afraid of whatever came through the Ardennes door. I doubt very much it compares to me. But because whatever is on the other side of that broken relic isn't a fixed thing. Integra Hellsing. It's a lottery. Your major's cultists reached blindly into somewhere else, and somewhere else answered twice. Once with something that slaughtered a room of scientists in minutes, and once with me. There is no guarantee the third answer is anything either of us would want to meet." His tail lashed, sharp and controlled. "And now the man responsible for that lottery understands there's a prize worth chasing. Then help me stop him from pulling the lever a third time," Integra said quietly. Beerus's magenta eyes settled on her, unreadable for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't quite name. "You said, this morning, that you didn't want a god fighting your war for you, that you'd rather keep me curious than obligated." A thin, humorless smile crossed his face. "Well, congratulations, Integra Hellsing. You've succeeded rather better than you intended. I'm not curious anymore. I'm invested." He rose from the table, tail curling once behind him. "Because whatever your major manages to pull through that door next, if he ever finishes rebuilding it, that's on a door that opened, once, because of me. I don't much care for the idea of something monstrous crawling out of the same hole I fell through, wearing my accident as its excuse to exist." His eyes hardened. "Find your Millennium facility. When you do, I want to be there. Not to fight your war, Integra Hellsing. To close the door myself, before anyone else gets to roll those dice again."
Enrico Maxwell learned of the Ardennes revelation 2 days later, through channels Iscariot maintained inside Hellsing's own communications network. Channels Integra suspected existed, tolerated because rooting them out cost more political capital than the leaks themselves, and which had, on this particular occasion, worked entirely to his advantage.
He convened the Section XI Council within the hour, in the same cathedral basement where the initial supernatural readings had first been logged, and laid the full picture before them with the cold, righteous clarity of a man who had spent his entire life certain that Hellsing's godless pragmatism would eventually cost the world something it couldn't afford to lose.
"God," he said, walking freely through London, having tea with Sir Integra Hellsing, while Millennium builds a machine to summon its like on command. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle across the assembled priests and Iscariot operatives. "Do any of you understand what we are looking at? This is not another chipper, another abomination born of Nazi science and blasphemy. This is a door into the divine, or something wearing its shape closely enough that the distinction may not matter. And it has been opened, twice now, on English soil, by men with no more understanding of what they were reaching for than children playing with a loaded weapon." His hand came down flat on the table. And Hellsing's response, having stumbled into custody of an actual god, was to offer it tea. A murmur ran through the room, some of it agreement, some of it the particular unease of men who had spent their lives fighting monsters they at least understood the shape of, now confronted with something that defied every category their doctrine had prepared them for. "Your Eminence," one of the younger priests ventured, "what would you have us do instead? Engage it directly? We have no precedent for combat against something of this scale. Even Father Anderson." "I am not suggesting we fight it," Maxwell snapped. "Not yet. I am suggesting that Hellsing has proven, once again, that it cannot be trusted with matters this far beyond its competence. Sir Integra treats a god like a diplomatic guest, to be managed with good manners and expensive tea, while the true danger, the door itself, and the madmen determined to keep opening it, goes unaddressed by anyone with the theological grounding to understand what's actually at stake."
He straightened, robes settling with the particular severity he reserved for moments he intended to be remembered. Section XIII will conduct its own investigation, quietly, alongside Hellsing's efforts if necessary, independently if not.
I want everything the Vatican archives hold, on doorways between realities, on entities that answer to titles like God without necessarily deserving them, and on the theological precedent, if any exists, for what the Church does when heaven's exclusive claim to divinity is suddenly, publicly, called into question by a creature that erases men for being rude to it. He paused, and something colder entered his voice. And find Anderson. If this situation deteriorates the way I fear it might, I want our best blade in London, not chasing heretics in Rio. Alexander Anderson received his recall orders in a small church outside Rio de Janeiro. Mid-confession with a local priest, he'd spent the better part of a week assisting against a minor infestation of ghouls that had, in the end, proven considerably less interesting than the theology he'd stayed to discuss afterward. He read the summons twice, Maxwell's handwriting, terse even by his usual standards, and felt something in his chest tighten with the particular, weary anticipation of a man who had learned, over many years of service, that Enrico Maxwell's version of urgent rarely disappointed in its capacity to be worse than expected. A god, the message read, in its entirety beyond the recall order itself, walking free in London. Come home, Alexander. I fear we are about to learn something about the shape of the world that none of our doctrine prepared us for. Anderson folded the paper, tucked it into his coat, and rose from the confessional with the slow, deliberate calm of a man who had faced down freak chippers, vampires, and the particular horror of Alucard himself without losing his footing, and who suspected, reading those two short lines, that all of it had simply been preparation for whatever waited for him now. "Bad news, Father?" the local priest asked. "Complicated news," Anderson said, and allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Seems London's grown itself a new kind of monster while I've been away, and knowin' Sir Helsing's particular gift for making friends with the things that ought to frighten her most, I imagine I'll be having words with it personally, before too long." Weiss found the fragment of relic Beerus had discovered in Wapping's ruined basement genuinely fascinating, in the particular way that centuries of accumulated cosmic patience made almost everything fascinating to him, and spent the better part of 2 days in Helsing's research wing, examining it under conditions the estate's own occult specialist found, by turns, awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. "It's not a single artifact," he explained to Integra, Walter, and a visibly nervous team of Helsing researchers gathered around the containment table where the fragment sat, pulsing its faint, sickly green light. "It's a composite. Several older objects, from at least 3 distinct traditions I recognize and one I don't, fused together, badly if I'm honest, the way a child might glue together pieces from 3 different jigsaw puzzles and call the result a picture. Whoever built this originally understood the individual components rather well. Whoever's been using it understands the whole rather poorly." He traced a finger an inch above the fragment's surface, not quite touching it, his expression thoughtful. "The pulling mechanism itself is crude but functional. Think of it as a hook cast blindly into very deep, very dark water. It doesn't choose what it catches. It simply catches whatever happens to be near enough and strong enough to be caught, which is why the Ardennes attempt pulled something violent and Wapping pulled Beerus," Integra said. "Precisely. Proximity and power, nothing more refined than that. At least, not yet." Wiss's gold eyes flicked toward her, and something in his expression sharpened. "Which is what concerns me about your major's stated intention to refine the working. If he genuinely believes he can learn to aim this thing, to select for power and controllability simultaneously, he is either deeply mistaken about how the mechanism functions, or he has access to knowledge about it that even I don't currently possess." Given the man's evident resourcefulness, I would not bet confidently on the former. Walter, who had been listening with his characteristic careful attention, spoke up. Could it be repaired to full function, assuming they recover this fragment, or build a replacement? Given time, resources, and enough disregard for their own safety, yes. Wiss's tone remained mild, but something beneath it had gone genuinely serious, which is precisely why I'd recommend against giving them that time. Integra straightened, decision already forming behind her eyes. Then we accelerate. Walter, I want every asset we have working the question of where Millennium's rebuilding this thing. Facilities, personnel, anything that matches the profile of what would be required. She turned to the fragment, dark and faintly pulsing on its containment table. And I want this kept secure, under constant watch, until we're certain nothing else is coming to collect it. Might I make a suggestion, Sir Integra? Wiss said, with the particular mild courtesy that Integra was beginning to learn, usually preceded something considerably more consequential than the tone implied. Lord Beerus has taken a personal interest in this matter, more personal, I suspect, than he'd readily admit. I believe you'll find him considerably more useful as an active participant in locating this facility than as a passive observer waiting for you to bring him results. A faint, knowing smile. He does so hate being kept waiting for the interesting part. As if summoned by the words themselves, Beerus's voice drifted in from the corridor beyond, unmistakably irritated. I can hear you talking about me, Wiss. I should certainly hope so, my lord. Wiss called back, entirely unbothered. I was rather counting on it. The search took 4 days, and it was Ceres in the end who found the thread that mattered. A shipping manifest, buried 3 layers deep in a logistics company Millennium had been laundering supplies through, listing a delivery of industrial ceramics to a disused radar station on the Suffolk coast that hadn't seen legitimate military use since the mid-1960s. It's the packaging that's wrong, she explained, spreading photographs across the briefing table for Integra, Walter, and, settled in the corner chair he'd more or less claimed as his own over the past 4 days, tail draped lazily over the armrest, Beerus, who had taken to attending these briefings with the proprietary interest of a stakeholder rather than a guest. Industrial ceramics don't need climate-controlled containers with this kind of shielding. I checked with our procurement people. This level of insulation is what you'd use for something sensitive to electromagnetic interference, or something you didn't want interfering with anything nearby. Or both, Walter said grimly. Integra studied the manifest, then the satellite imagery Walter had pulled of the Suffolk facility. A squat concrete structure, fenced, ostensibly abandoned, but showing the particular telltale signs of recent activity that 4 days of Hellsing's accumulated intelligence work had learned to recognize instantly. Increased vehicle traffic, new fencing, a generator running at a facility with no official power draw. That's it, she said. That's where they're rebuilding it. Beerus uncurled from his chair, magenta eyes sharpening with the first genuine focus she'd seen from him in days. How far? Suffolk coast. 90 miles, give or take. Integra met his gaze steadily. I intend to hit it tonight, before they get any further along than they already are. Alucard leads the assault. Ceres and a support team secure the perimeter. Walter coordinates from the field command post. She paused, weighing her next words with the particular care she'd learned, over 4 days, that conversations with Beerus rewarded. You said you wanted to be there when we closed this door. I meant to honor that. But I want to be clear about something first. This isn't a request for you to win this fight for us. If Alucard can't handle what's inside that facility, that's a failure of my planning, not a gap for you to fill reflexively. I'd rather you observed and intervened only if something genuinely beyond us shows up. Beerus's mouth curved, something between amusement and approval. You keep doing that, he said. Drawing the line just short of asking me to solve your problems for you. It's an odd kind of restraint. For a species I've watched beg gods for exactly the opposite in every other world I've bothered visiting.
I told you I'd rather keep you curious than obligated, Integra said. I meant it. This is your war exactly as much as it needs to be, and not 1 inch further, unless you decide otherwise. Good answer. Beerus rose, tail flicking, something sharp and eager settling into his posture now that the waiting was finally, genuinely over. Then I'll observe, closely, and if your vampire proves insufficient to the task, the faint, dangerous edge crept back into his voice, I'll be considerably less patient about the men responsible for this than I was about the fool who shot me in a basement. The facility, when Alucard's forces reached it a little past midnight, proved considerably better defended than the shipping manifest had suggested. Not merely a rebuilding site, but a fully operational forward base, garrisoned by 2 full companies of Millennium's vampire soldiers, and Sarah's noted with a cold jolt of recognition through her comms as the first shots rang out. At least 1 freak chipper unit held in reserve behind the inner fence line. Alucard went through the outer perimeter the way a scythe goes through wheat. Unhurried, almost bored, the particular economy of motion that 500 years of war had refined into something closer to art than violence. Millennium's soldiers, veterans of 100 smaller engagements, died in the dozens within the first 2 minutes, their bodies barely registering as obstacles before his blades found the next and the next after that. It was not, however, a clean fight for long. Movement, second tower, north side, Saris called into her comm, cannon already tracking. Multiple hostiles. Wait, that's not... Walter, I've got something coming off the roof that isn't standard chipper configuration. The figure that dropped from the tower's edge landed with the particular grace of something that had never once in its long, unnatural existence needed to worry about the fall hurting it. A woman. Pale-haired, rifle slung with the casual familiarity of a marksman who trusted the weapon the way most people trusted their own hands. Magic already gathering at her fingertips in shimmering, faintly musical threads. Rip Van Winkle, Walter's voice came through the comm, tight with recognition. One of Millennium's captains. Saris, do not engage her directly. Her magic bullets ignore standard cover. They'll find you regardless of what you're hiding behind. Bit late for that warning, innit? Saris muttered, already diving as the first shimmering round tore through the concrete barrier she'd been using for cover as though it were paper, close enough to singe the edge of her coat. From the ridge overlooking the facility 300 yards distant, Beerus watched the engagement unfold with an expression of increasingly pointed disapproval, not at the violence itself, which he found, if anything, mildly diverting, but at the particular tactical wrinkle now emerging from the facility's central bunker, where a low, sustained hum had begun to rise, audible even at this distance, accompanied by a faint green glow bleeding through the reinforced windows. "Whis," he said quietly. "I feel it too, my lord." Wiss's expression had lost its habitual mildness entirely. "They've completed the array. It's active." Beerus's tail went rigid. "Now? It would appear the timing is not coincidental, my lord. I suspect this assault has forced their hand, rather than caught them unprepared." Wiss's gold eyes fixed on the bunker, tracking something neither Integra nor her people could perceive. They're attempting to open the passage under combat conditions. Reckless, possibly desperate, possibly. His brow furrowed, possibly exactly what they intended all along. A distraction to force Hellsing's hand at precisely the moment they wished to test the working. Below them, in the field command post half a mile back, Integra's voice crackled through every comm channel simultaneously, sharp with sudden alarm. "All units report, I'm reading a massive energy spike from the central structure. Repeat, massive spike, Walter. What am I looking at?" "They're opening it, Sir Integra," Walter said grimly, watching his own instrument readouts climb into ranges he'd never seen them reach. "They're opening it now." On the ridge, Beerus rose to his feet, the last vestiges of idle observation falling away entirely, replaced by the flat, focused stillness of a god who had just watched the exact scenario he'd spent 4 days dreading begin to unfold 90 miles from the tea he'd been drinking that morning. Well, he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very cold. All trace of boredom, finally, completely burned away. I did warn her I'd get involved if this stopped being merely inconvenient. He glanced at Wyss. Shall we go find out what her majors finally managed to catch?
The bunker's reinforced doors did not so much open as cease to exist, the sheer force of what was building within simply overwhelming the concrete and steel that had been meant to contain it. And for one suspended, terrible moment, everyone on that ridge and in that field, Hellsing soldiers scrambling for cover,
Millennium's vampire ranks faltering mid-engagement, Rip Van Winkle herself pausing with her rifle still raised, sensing something even her considerable arrogance recognized as beyond the scope of the fight she'd been enjoying, simply watched. Inside the ruined structure, the relic's rebuilt array pulsed with sick, arrhythmic green light, the same crude, cobbled-together hunger Wyss had described days earlier, now scaled up 100-fold, straining against whatever crude containment the doctor's team had managed to bolt around it. The Major stood at its edge, hands clasped behind his back, watching with the rapt, delighted attention of a man witnessing the birth of something he had spent his entire existence hungry for, entirely unbothered by the battle collapsing around his forward base. "There," he murmured, to no one, to everyone, to the working itself. "There it is." The passage tore open with a sound like the world itself exhaling, and something came through. It was not Beerus. It was not anything close to Beerus, in scale or in shape or in the particular quality of presence that had, days earlier, made Alucard's 5 centuries of accumulated confidence quietly reconsider itself. What emerged from the tear was smaller, hunched, wrong in the specific way that things which should not exist in ordinary space are wrong. A mass of writhing, indistinct limbs too numerous to easily count, skin the color of old bruises, eyes that opened across its surface in irregular clusters, blinking with individual, asynchronous malice. It did not walk so much as unfold itself into the ruined bunker, each new joint and limb arriving with a faint, wet sound that made even Millennium's hardened soldiers, veterans of 100 atrocities, take an involuntary step back. It was, Wyss observed grimly from the ridge, exactly the kind of thing that answered a blind, desperate pull cast into deep water, not chosen, not controllable, simply there, near enough and hungry enough to be caught. "That," Beerus said, watching the creature unfold with an expression that had gone entirely flat, entirely focused, "is considerably less charming than I am." It moved fast, faster than its bulk suggested it should be capable of, and the first 3 Millennium soldiers nearest the breach didn't have time to scream before it was among them, limbs lashing out in patterns that defied ordinary anatomy, and where they struck flesh, flesh simply came apart, not cut, not torn, but unmade in a manner that echoed, with horrible imprecision, the same kind of erasure Beerus himself had demonstrated in a whopping basement 4 nights earlier, except sloppier, hungrier, without the faintest trace of restraint or intention behind it. "Major?" The doctor's voice cracked across the chaos, pure terror stripping away every ounce of scientific detachment he'd maintained until this moment. "It's not stable, it's not. We have no control over it. We need to seal the breach." "Seal it," the Major agreed pleasantly, still watching with rapt fascination as the creature turned, slow and deliberate, toward the largest concentration of movement in the room, once we've seen precisely what it's capable of. "Patience, Doctor. This is the most interesting thing to happen to this war in months." His patience, as it turned out, was almost immediately and catastrophically misplaced. The creature did not confine its interest to Hellsing's attacking forces, nor even to the general chaos of combat. It turned with the same asynchronous, many-eyed attention it had shown everything else in the room, toward the largest gathering of magic it could sense, which happened, in that moment, to be the Major's own command staff, clustered protectively around the array they had just finished tearing open. "Ah," the Major said,
watching it approach with the sudden dawning recalculation of a man realizing his gambit had a flaw he hadn't accounted for. That is somewhat less ideal. On the ridge, Beerus moved. There was no announcement of it, no gathering of power, no dramatic flourish of the kind Alucard might have offered before entering a fight he considered worth his effort. One moment the god stood beside Whis, watching the unfolding disaster below with cold, focused attention, and the next, the space he had occupied was simply empty. The air rushing in to fill it with a soft, displaced crack, and he was there, standing in the ruined heart of the bunker between the writhing creature and the scattering ranks of the major's staff, having crossed 90 miles and the length of a battlefield in less time than it took most of the combatants present to blink. The creature paused. It was, Beerus reflected with the small, cold, professional part of his mind that had assessed 10,000 threats across 10,000 worlds, not stupid, not in any conventional sense, not possessed of anything resembling reasoning, but equipped with something older and more animal than reason. The instinct that told even the hungriest, most indiscriminate predator, in the half-second before it made a fatal mistake, that some things were simply not prey. Its many eyes fixed on him, all of them, at once, the asynchronous blinking falling suddenly, uncannily still. "Yes," Beerus said, into the silence that had fallen across the bunker, his voice carrying without effort over the receding chaos of gunfire and screaming that had, moment by moment, begun to falter into stunned quiet, as every combatant present, Hellsing and Millennium alike, registered exactly what had just interposed itself between them. "I thought that might get your attention." The creature lunged. It was fast, genuinely fast, faster than anything born of ordinary physics had any right to be, limbs unfolding and lashing forward in a blur that would have, against anything short of what actually stood in its path, ended the confrontation in the same fraction of a second it had ended the lives of the 3 soldiers moments before. Beerus did not move. The limb struck him, struck the space where a lesser being's chest would have been vital, would have mattered, would have been the difference between living and dying, and simply stopped, the way water stops against stone, the creature's entire considerable momentum arrested in an instant, with no visible effort on the god's part whatsoever. For a moment the two of them remained locked in that pose, the creature's limb pressed uselessly against Beerus's raised palm, its many eyes blinking in what might, in a being capable of genuine emotion, have been called confusion. "My turn," Beerus said. He didn't erase it. That, he had already decided, watching it unfold from the tear moments before, would be a mercy it hadn't earned, and a waste of the only genuinely useful thing about it. The fact that it represented, however crudely, a piece of evidence about the mechanism that had dragged him into this world in the first place, evidence Whis would very much want intact enough to study. Instead, his free hand closed around the limb, with a grip that made something deep in the creature's malformed anatomy audibly crack, and with a single contemptuous motion, he drove it down into the concrete floor of the bunker, hard enough to crater it, pinning the writhing mass of limbs and eyes in place with a casual, absolute finality that made every soldier still capable of watching understand, in that instant, precisely what category of being had just entered their fight. "Whis," Beerus called out, without looking away from the pinned creature. "Come collect this. Carefully. I want to know exactly what it is, and exactly how badly our friend the Major mangled the working to bring it through in this state." Whis arrived beside him a moment later, staff already extended, a shimmering containment field blooming outward from its tip to envelop the creature's thrashing form. "As you wish, my lord." His gold eyes flicked briefly toward the Major, who stood frozen at the edge of the ruined array, his customary genial smile faltering for the first time since anyone present had known him. "Though I suspect our host has rather more pressing concerns at the moment than my curiosity." Beerus followed his gaze, and something in his expression, flat, cold,
and entirely without the boredom that had defined nearly every prior encounter, settled on the Major with the particular finality of a verdict already reached.
"You're the one who's been reaching into that door," Beerus said, and his voice, quiet as it was, seemed to fill the entire ruined bunker, silencing whatever remained of the fighting around them. Twice, before tonight, 11 dead men in the Ardennes. Me, dragged out of my own dinner by a bunch of desperate fools who barely understood what they'd built. And now this, a small contemptuous glance at the pinned, writhing creature, which you were apparently willing to unleash on your own soldiers just to see what it could do. The Major's smile returned, slowly, with the particular resilience of a man who had never once in his existence allowed fear to fully take hold of him. "Guilty as charged, I'm afraid," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of theatrical surrender that fooled absolutely no one, least of all Beerus. "Though I confess, I hadn't quite dared hope you'd deliver yourself to my doorstep so promptly. Saves me the trouble of coming to find you." "Careful," Beerus said, and took a single, unhurried step toward him, the temperature in the ruined bunker dropping with a suddenness that had nothing to do with the night air outside. "I already don't like you very much. You're testing exactly how much further that dislike is willing to travel before I stop finding this conversation worth having." The Major, to his considerable credit, did not flinch, though something in his broad, genial face had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man recalculating, in real time, every assumption he'd built his entire war around. "Do you know," he said, conversational despite the god standing 8 feet from him with a visibly murderous focus, "what I find endlessly fascinating about power, Lord Beerus? That is your title, isn't it? Delivered to me secondhand through rather breathless Hellsing communications I was never meant to intercept. I find it fascinating that power, however vast, however cosmic, however capable of unmaking a man with a single idle gesture, still requires a reason to act. You erased a fool in a basement because he was rude to you. You've pinned my unfortunate accident there," a nod toward the writhing, contained creature, "because it threatened people you've apparently decided to care about, however briefly. But me? I haven't threatened you at all. I've merely been curious, the same as you were 4 days ago, about a door neither of us built." His smile widened. "Tell me plainly, are you here to kill me? Or are you here because Sir Integra asked you nicely to observe, and observing has simply gotten rather more interesting than either of you anticipated?" It was. Beerus reflected with cold, private irritation, an infuriatingly accurate read of the situation. "I'm here," Beerus said, "because you opened a door twice already without my permission, and you clearly intend to open it a third time the moment I'm not standing in this room to stop you. That's reason enough." His tail lashed once, sharp. "As for killing you, I haven't decided yet. You're right that I don't erase things out of obligation. I do it because I find them tiresome, or because they've stopped being worth the restraint it takes not to. You're dangerously close to that line, little man. I'd recommend you stop talking and start explaining, very quickly, exactly what you intended to do with whatever answered your door tonight, before my patience finishes running out entirely." From the ruined perimeter behind them, Alucard arrived at last, having cut a bloody, unhurried path through the remainder of Millennium's garrison, his coat soaked through, grin wider and hungrier than it had been all night, red eyes taking in the scene before him with genuine, delighted surprise. "Well," he said, stepping over the last of a fallen soldier without particular ceremony, "I leave you alone for 20 minutes, and you've already found something worth threatening properly." "Computer sales? Computer sales?" At the Major, at Beerus's cold, focused stillness, and his grin sharpened into something closer to reverence. "Master's going to be very put out that she missed this part." "She isn't missing much," Beerus said, not looking away from the Major. "He's stalling, waiting for something." The Major's smile, for the first time, flickered. A fraction of a second, gone almost before it registered, but Beerus had spent an eternity reading exactly that kind of expression,
across 1,000 different faces, on 1,000 different worlds, and he recognized it immediately for what it was.
"You're right," the Major admitted, with the particular good humor of a man who had already accepted that his gambit had failed and had, characteristically, decided to enjoy the failure rather than resist it. "I am stalling, though not, I should clarify, for reinforcements. Schrodinger's not coming, and frankly I doubt he'd be much use against you regardless. I'm stalling because I wish to see, before this ends, exactly how far a god's patience genuinely extends when properly provoked. Consider it research, Lord Beerus. I am, after all, a student of exactly this kind of variable." He spread his hands again, and this time the gesture carried none of the theater from before. Simple, almost weary acceptance. "I imagine I've learned rather more than I bargained for. The array is destroyed, my little accident is contained, and my forward base is, by my count, entirely overrun. I don't believe there's anything left here worth your continued attention, is there?" Beerus studied him for a long, silent moment, the particular calculation of a being deciding, in real time, whether a threat that had just openly admitted its intentions still qualified as one. "You'll try again," Beerus said. "It wasn't a question. Almost certainly," the Major agreed, with a cheerfulness that would have been genuinely admirable in nearly any other context. "I am, if nothing else, a very persistent man. Then I have a decision to make about whether letting you walk out of this bunker is a mistake I'm willing to live with." Beerus took another step forward, close enough now that the Major's considerable composure finally, visibly wavered. "Give me one reason it isn't." It was Integra's voice, sharp and sudden over the comm still clipped to Alucard's collar, that answered before the Major could. "Because killing him here, tonight, accomplishes nothing except making a martyr out of a man whose organization will simply promote someone worse in his place," she said, having listened to the entire exchange from the field command post with the particular controlled fury of a commander watching her carefully planned assault spiral into something considerably larger than she'd authorized. "Beerus, I need him captured, not erased. Alive, he's a source of intelligence on how deep this reaches. Dead, he's a rallying cry and a dead end, and we lose every thread that leads back to whoever's actually funding and directing Millennium's leadership above him." Beerus's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, something in his rigid posture easing by a fraction, not relenting, not yet, but genuinely considering. "You want me to let him live," he said, flat. "I want you to let me decide what happens to him," Integra corrected, her voice steady despite the distance and the chaos still crackling faintly through the calm behind her words. "You told me 4 days ago that you weren't here to fight my war for me. I'm asking you to hold to that now, when it's hardest, not just when it was convenient." A pause, and something almost gentler entered her tone. "I don't doubt you could end this in half a second and be right to do it. I'm asking you not to, because I think there's more value in what he knows than in what erasing him would prove." For a long moment, Beerus said nothing, the cold fury still radiating off him in waves that made even Alucard, standing a careful distance away, feel something uncomfortably close to genuine unease. Then, slowly, he exhaled, and the temperature in the ruined bunker climbed back toward something survivable. "Fine," he said, and there was no mistaking the effort it cost him to say it. He reached out, almost lazily, and closed one clawed hand around the front of the Major's coat, lifting the considerably larger man off his feet, with an ease that made the gesture somehow more frightening than any display of overt violence could have managed. "Your Integra Hellsing gets her prisoner, little man. Consider that a gift from her, not a mercy from me. Because if I ever catch even the faintest whisper that you've opened that door a third time, I will not be nearly so accommodating about being talked out of what happens next." His magenta eyes, inches from the Major's own, held nothing remotely resembling the earlier calm. "Do you understand me?" The Major, dangling a full foot off the ground in the grip of an angry god, managed, with what Beerus privately, grudgingly acknowledged was genuinely remarkable composure, something close to his usual smile. Perfectly, he said. Though I should mention, Lord Beerus, purely in the interest of thoroughness, I am not, and have never been, the one truly directing this war. I am merely its most enthusiastic architect. His eyes glinted, delighted despite everything, despite the very real possibility of his own imminent unmaking. There are considerably larger forces at play here than one curious man and his little relic, but that, his smile widened, I rather suspect, is a conversation best had with Sir Integra directly, once your considerable temper has had time to cool. Beerus stared at him a moment longer, weighing the words, weighing the particular unbothered delight in the Major's expression even now, and then, with a sound of pure disgust, dropped him unceremoniously onto the cratered concrete floor. "Whis," he said, turning away. "Take the creature. I've had quite enough of this bunker for one night." By the time Integra herself reached the ruined bunker, driven the last stretch by Walter through a countryside lit orange with the dying fires of Millennium's overrun forward base, the fighting had ended entirely, the last of the garrison either dead, fled, or in a handful of cases, kneeling in the mud under Hellsing guard with the particular hollow-eyed shock of soldiers who had watched something far beyond their understanding tear their command structure apart in under a minute. She found Beerus sitting on the shattered remains of the array's containment ring, tail curled around his feet, watching Wiss's shimmering field hold the pinned creature with the flat, exhausted patience of someone who had spent his anger and found, on the other side of it, mostly a deep and abiding weariness with the entire evening. "You let him live," she said, approaching without hesitation, though the ground around them still steamed faintly where his fury had scorched the concrete. "I let you decide whether he lived," Beerus corrected, not looking up. "There's a difference, and I'd appreciate you remembering it. The next time you're tempted to give me an order in the middle of a fight, I've already half decided to finish myself." He glanced sideways at her, something in his expression easing, the edge of genuine irritation softening into something closer to grudging respect. "You made a good argument. I don't like that I agreed with it as quickly as I did. I'll take the compliment, however reluctantly it's offered." Integra's gaze moved past him to where Millennium soldiers were being processed under guard, to the ruined array still smoking in the bunker's shattered heart, and finally to the Major himself, seated now, hands bound, under a heavy guard detail, wearing an expression of such genuine, undiminished good humor that it made her skin crawl more than any amount of open hostility could have. He said something, before Alucard reported in, that he wasn't the one truly directing this, that there are larger forces at play. He did. Beerus's tail flicked, irritated afresh at the memory. I don't know if it's true, or if it's simply the kind of thing a clever, cornered man says to buy himself leverage in exactly this situation. But I'd treat it as true until you've confirmed otherwise. Men that pleased with themselves, even facing down a god with his hand around their collar, don't usually bluff without something real behind it. Integra was quiet for a long moment, watching the Major's distant, unbothered smile, feeling the full weight of the evening settle into something considerably heavier than the tactical victory it technically represented. They had destroyed the array. They had captured Millennium's chief architect. They had, against every reasonable expectation she'd carried into this operation, survived an encounter with something pulled directly from whatever waited on the other side of that door. Survived it specifically because a being of near unlimited power had chosen, 4 days after arriving in her city entirely by accident, to stand between that creature and her people without being asked. And somewhere above all of that, apparently, sat someone or something with enough authority over Millennium's operations to make even the Major answer to a will, not entirely his own. Then we start there, she said finally. Tomorrow. Tonight, I want this facility fully secured, the creature contained and studied, and the Major somewhere none of his remaining people can reach him before we've had the chance to learn everything he's willing to tell us. She turned to Beerus fully,
and something in her expression carried a genuine, unguarded gratitude she rarely extended to anyone.
Thank you for tonight. I know I asked you to hold back more than you wanted to. Beerus studied her for a moment, magenta eyes unreadable in the firelight, and then, unexpectedly, allowed himself something close to a real smile. You're the only interesting thing that's happened to me on this planet in longer than I care to admit, he said. Try not to waste the novelty by getting yourself killed chasing whatever's actually behind that man's smile. I'd find that considerably more annoying than entertaining. They did not have to wait long to learn how right the Major's parting words had been. The interrogation began the following morning in a secure facility beneath the Hellsing estate, conducted jointly by Integra and, at his own insistence, delivered with the flat, unbothered certainty of a being who had decided, somewhere over the course of the previous night, that he had earned a stake in how this particular thread played out. Beerus himself, seated in the corner of the interrogation room, with the proprietary patience of a stakeholder rather than a spectator. The Major answered questions about the array's construction freely, almost cheerfully, the way a proud craftsman might discuss a piece he no longer had any particular attachment to. He answered questions about the Ardennes incident with the same unbothered candor, filling in details about the 11 dead researchers that made even Walter's carefully composed features tighten with barely concealed disgust. It was only when Integra asked, directly, who he answered to above his own considerable authority within Millennium's ranks, that his manner shifted, not into fear, never quite fear, but into something almost like genuine, rueful respect for the question itself. Ah, he said, settling back in his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man finally reaching the part of the conversation he'd been most looking forward to. Now that, Sir Integra, is the question I rather suspected would take you longest to ask, and I confess I've been looking forward to answering it more than almost anything else about this whole delightful mess. His eyes flicked briefly toward Beerus, and something in his smile sharpened with genuine, unmistakable relish. You see, our little relic, the one your new friend so thoroughly interrupted, was never truly my project, not at its root. I merely inherited it, along with rather more detailed instructions than I let on, from someone considerably higher up our organization's true command structure than the doctor or I have ever been permitted to meet in person. Someone who has taken, shall we say, a very long and very patient interest in exactly what kind of things live on the other side of doors like the one we opened. A name, Integra said, flat. I don't have one to give you. Truly, I don't say that to be difficult, Sir Integra, whatever else you may think of me. The Major spread his bound hands, the gesture almost apologetic. What I can tell you is that the instructions accompanying that relic specified, quite precisely, what kind of answer we were meant to be fishing for. Not power in the abstract, not simply something strong enough to be useful. His smile widened, terrible and genuine at once, and his gaze settled, deliberately, on Beerus. We were told, specifically, to listen for anything that answered to the word God. Whoever gave me that relic, Lord Beerus, already knew, long before your unfortunate arrival, that such things were real and reachable and worth the trouble of building a door for. I rather suspect they knew a great deal more about you, or beings like you, than either of us has yet had the pleasure of learning. The silence that followed stretched long and cold, and for the first time since his arrival in London, Beerus felt something settle across his shoulders that he had not felt in a very, very long time. Not concern for himself, precisely, but the slow, dawning recognition that his presence here might never have been quite the accident everyone, himself included, had spent the last 5 days assuming it was. The revelation sat over the estate for 3 days like weather that refused to break. Integra burying herself in cross-referenced intelligence, hunting for any thread connecting the relic's true origin to something, and Toe 1, above Millennium's known command structure. Beerus retreating,
more than once, into long stretches of uncharacteristic quiet that Weiss recognized, with the particular concern of centuries spent reading his lord's moods, as something considerably more troubled than mere irritation. He found Beerus on the estate's east lawn on the third evening, seated on the low stone wall overlooking the grounds, tail still, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. "You've been thinking," Weiss observed, settling beside him without invitation. "I don't like being known, Weiss." Beerus's voice was quiet, stripped of its usual lazy drawl. "Whoever built that instruction, whoever told the Major exactly what word to listen for, understood something about beings like us that took most civilizations across most universes their entire existence to even begin suspecting. Not that gods might be real, that we might be reachable, summonable. Worth the trouble of building a door for, on the specific gamble that something with my kind of power might eventually answer." His claws pressed briefly into the stone beneath him, leaving 4 shallow grooves. "I have spent longer than this planet's sun has existed, being the thing other things fear finding. I do not enjoy discovering that something, somewhere, has apparently been hunting for exactly that instead." Weiss was quiet for a moment, weighing his response with the particular care he reserved for the rare occasions his lord's composure genuinely cracked. "You're not wrong to be troubled, my lord. But consider, whoever constructed those instructions did so without any guarantee of success, using a relic so crude and poorly understood that it took a Millennium cell 3 failed attempts across 18 months to produce even one usable result. This isn't the work of something that has mastered the art of summoning gods. It's the work of something that has only just begun guessing at the possibility and gotten extraordinarily, dangerously lucky once." He turned his gold eyes toward the darkening sky, "which means, whatever this is, it does not yet know what it caught. It knows only that its hook found something. You still hold every advantage that matters." Beerus considered that, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, though not all of it. "Small comfort. Perhaps, but it is, I think, the correct comfort to hold on to, rather than none at all." Weiss rose, offering a small, genuine smile. "Besides, I rather suspect you're not planning to simply wait patiently for whoever this is to find you again." A thin, sharp smile answered him, some of the old, dangerous humor returning to Beerus's expression at last. "No," he agreed. "I think instead, I'm going to make it very easy for them to regret finding me at all." Integra's breakthrough came not from the Major, who had told them everything he genuinely knew and had, in the days since, settled into his cell with the same unbothered good humor he brought to everything, but from the creature itself, contained, sedated, and subjected to careful, patient examination by Weiss, who spent 2 full days coaxing fragments of understanding from something that possessed no language Hellsing's researchers could recognize, and which Weiss, working alone in ways that made even Walter's considerable scientific staff quietly step back and let him work, eventually confirmed carried, buried deep in whatever passed for its nature, a faint but unmistakable residue. "It's been marked," Weiss reported, in the same briefing room that had, 10 days earlier, first hosted a god over tea. A kind of signature, layered into the creature, at a level far below anything the relic itself could have produced. Whoever, or whatever, first identified this particular corner of existence as worth reaching into, left something behind in the process. "A trace, faint but genuine." He set a small, complex diagram on the table, not a map precisely, but something closer to it, rendered in notation none of the assembled Hellsing staff could parse, though Integra studied it with the fixed, hungry attention of a woman finally being handed something resembling a lead. "It suggests, my lord, that whatever we're dealing with has attempted this kind of reaching before, elsewhere, likely many times, likely across more than just this single world, and has been doing so for considerably longer than 18 months. Beerus's expression had gone flat and cold again, the particular stillness Integra had learned, over the past 10 days to recognize as his genuine attention rather than his idle boredom. You're saying this isn't just a London problem?
I'm saying, my lord, that I don't believe it ever was. Wiss's gaze was grave. I would very much like your permission to investigate further, properly, using resources this world simply doesn't possess. It may take some time. But if something out there has genuinely been hunting for beings like yourself, across worlds, for as long as this signature suggests, I believe we owe it to more than just London to find out exactly what and why before it tries again somewhere with considerably less warning than a crude basement ritual gave us here. Integra looked between the two of them, the god who had fallen into her city by accident, and the attendant now proposing to leave it, however temporarily, to chase down a threat that dwarfed even the vast scale of what they'd already survived, and felt the particular, familiar weight of a commander watching her carefully bounded crisis reveal itself as something considerably larger than she'd had any right to expect when she'd picked up the phone 10 days earlier. "Go," she said finally. "Find out what you can. But Beerus," she turned to him, something steady and genuine in her voice, "whatever this turns out to be, you have allies here now, not obligated ones, not ones keeping you out of duty." A faint, deliberate echo of words she'd chosen carefully, days ago, in this same room. Curious ones. If this comes back to London, or comes back to you at all, you won't be facing it alone, if you don't want to be. Beerus studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression, guarded, still, but genuinely, unmistakably warmer than the flat boredom he'd worn on that first rooftop 10 days ago, settled into something like quiet resolve. "Good," he said, "because I have absolutely no intention of making this easy for whoever's out there. Let them come looking a second time. I'll be considerably less accommodating about it than I was the first." Alexander Anderson arrived in London 2 days later, stepping off a transatlantic flight into a city he found, on his first afternoon back, considerably stranger than the one he'd left. Not in any way he could immediately point to, but in the particular quality of the air over certain neighborhoods. A faint, cosmic pressure he recognized, with the trained instinct of a man who had spent his career sensing exactly this kind of wrongness, as something entirely outside his considerable experience. He found Maxwell waiting for him at Section Sia's London offices. Papers spread across his desk in the particular disarray of a man who had spent days chasing an answer that kept sliding just out of reach. "You feel it too," Maxwell said, without preamble, as Anderson entered. "Hard not to, Your Eminence." Anderson set his bag down, blessed blade still strapped across his back from the flight, and studied the papers scattered across Maxwell's desk with a soldier's economy. 10 days, and half the city's talking in whispers about a purple fella who's apparently having tea with Sir Hellsing herself. That true? True enough that I've spent the past 10 days deciding whether it's the greatest threat this organization has ever faced, or an opportunity Rome would be foolish not to at least investigate directly. Maxwell rose, moving to the window, his expression carrying the particular weight of a man wrestling openly with doctrine he'd spent his entire life certain of. "I want you to make contact, Alexander, not to fight it. God knows what that would accomplish, if even Alucard himself declined the invitation. I want you to speak with it, theologically. I want to know what it believes itself to be, and I want your honest read, soldier, to, whatever it is, of whether it poses the danger I fear, or whether Hellsing has, against every reasonable expectation, actually managed to make something resembling peace with it." Anderson considered that for a long moment, then allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Never thought I'd hear you asking me to go have a chat with something, Your Eminence, rather than put a blade through it. Neither did I," Maxwell admitted, "but I've read enough of the reports coming out of Hellsing's own channels to understand that whatever's sitting in that estate right now isn't something blades solve. If it can be reasoned with, genuinely, honestly reasoned with, then perhaps our doctrine has more room in it than I've allowed myself to believe. And if it can't," his jaw tightened, "then I want our best man's read on that too,
before Rome decides what comes next.
The meeting, when it happened 2 days later on the Hellsing estate's grounds, arranged with unusual formality, Integra present, Alucard lurking at a careful distance, with the particular delighted anticipation of a man watching two old rivalries finally intersect with something entirely new, carried none of the violence either side had half expected. Anderson approached alone, blade sheathed, hands visibly empty, and found Beerus seated on the same low garden wall where Weiss had found him days earlier, watching the priest's approach with mild, unhurried curiosity. "You're the one they sent to ask questions instead of swing a blade," Beerus observed, before Anderson had said a word. "Aye." Anderson stopped a respectful distance away, studying the small lavender figure with the frank, appraising attention of a man who had spent his whole life measuring monsters and had never once encountered anything that made the exercise feel this genuinely inadequate. "Section XII wanted to know what you believed yourself to be. Whether the word God was something you'd earned or something you'd simply decided to wear. An honest question." Something in Beerus's expression shifted, faint approval. "Most of your kind either worship first and ask questions never, or attack first and never get the chance to ask at all." "I appreciate the novelty of being asked directly." He considered his answer for a long moment. "I don't destroy out of malice, priest. Not usually. I exist to prune, to remove what's grown too dangerous, too stagnant, too far past what a wider balance can safely tolerate. It isn't kind. It isn't cruel either. It simply is what I am, the same way you're a man who kills monsters because the world needs someone willing to." His eyes, magenta and unblinking, held Anderson's without flinching. "Does that answer satisfy your church's curiosity, or does it merely confirm every fear Rome's already decided to have about me?" Anderson was quiet for a long moment, weighing the answer with genuine, careful thought. "Honestly," he said finally, "it's closer to something I can respect than I expected walking in here. Doesn't mean I trust you. Doesn't mean Rome will either. Not fully, not for a long while yet. But a thing that tells the truth about what it is, even when lying would be easier." He allowed himself a small, grim smile. "That's rarer than you'd think, in my line of work. I'll tell Maxwell you're not the apocalypse he was bracing for. Whether that buys you any real peace with Section XIII, that's above my pay grade to promise." "Fair enough." Beerus's tail flicked, something almost like satisfaction in the gesture. "Tell your Maxwell this too, priest. I have no interest in his war, his doctrine, or his city's soul. I have an interest in whoever built the door that dragged me here in the first place, and considerably less patience for being hunted than most things your organization has faced before me. If Rome wants to stay out of my way while I find them, we'll never have a single problem worth mentioning." "And if Rome doesn't stay out of the way?" Beerus's smile turned thin, sharp, and entirely without malice, which somehow made it more unsettling than any threat delivered in anger could have been. "Then I suppose we'll find out together," he said, "exactly how much of what you just called respect survives the test." The final piece of the puzzle came not from Weiss's investigation, nor from the Major's continued cheerfully unhelpful cooperation, but from Integra herself. 3 weeks after the Suffolk facility fell, poring over the last of the recovered Millennium archives with the particular dogged patience that had, over the course of her tenure, solved every crisis this organization had faced before it. She found it buried in a shipping ledger dated 18 months before the Ardennes incident, a single line item easily overlooked amid 1,000 others, recording the original acquisition of the relic itself, not purchased, not stolen, but delivered, by an intermediary whose name appeared nowhere else in Millennium's records, to a facility whose designation matched nothing in any registry Hellsing possessed. She brought it to Beerus and Weiss the following morning, laid out on the same desk where their first conversation had taken place 3 weeks earlier. "A delivery," Weiss said, studying the entry with sharpening interest. "Not a discovery.
Someone gave this relic to Millennium, knowing, or at least hoping, precisely what it might eventually catch. His gold eyes lifted to meet Integra's. "This is more than we've had in 3 weeks of searching, Sir Integra. This is a name to chase, even if it's a false one." "It's a start," Integra agreed, "not an ending. Whoever's behind this has had 18 months head start, and considerably more patience than the Major ever showed. This isn't a war we win in a single raid." She looked up at Beerus, who had gone quiet, studying the ledger entry with the same flat, focused attention he'd shown the pinned creature 3 weeks before. "I won't pretend I know how long this takes, or where it leads, but I intend to keep chasing it, for however long that turns out to be. London's mine to protect. Whatever reached across worlds to plant a hook in my city is now, as far as I'm concerned, exactly as much my problem as it is yours." Beerus was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, something in his voice carried a weight it hadn't held on that first rooftop, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. "You know," he said, "when Wiss's fold caught on that idiotic little ritual, I assumed the worst thing that could happen was that I'd be stuck on some backwater rock, missing dinner, until he sorted out how to get us home." He rose from his chair, moving to the window, looking out over a London that had, over 3 weeks, become, against every reasonable expectation he'd have held walking into this, genuinely, stubbornly interesting to him. "Instead, I found a war I didn't ask for, a city full of things trying to kill each other, over reasons that mostly amount to fear and old grudges, and a woman clever enough to talk a god out of losing his temper more than once." He glanced back at her, and the faint, genuine warmth in his expression was unmistakable now, 3 weeks in the making. "I could go home tomorrow if Wiss finally worked out how. Might even be the smart thing to do, given what's apparently been hunting for things like me out there." His tail curled, decisive. "But I find I'm not in any particular hurry. Not yet. Not while there's still a thread worth pulling, and a city that's finally stopped shooting at me first and asking questions second." Wiss's smile, watching his lord say the words, was quiet and deeply, genuinely satisfied. "I'll continue the search, my lord, wherever it leads. But I confess, I'm rather glad you've decided the destination can wait a while longer." "Don't get sentimental about it, Wiz." Beerus's tail flicked, though the sharpness in his voice had gone soft at the edges. "I'm staying for the food. And the company." A pause, magenta eyes settling once more on Integra, something like genuine respect passing between them. Mostly the company. 3 weeks after a crude, desperate ritual tore a hole in the fabric of 2 worlds, London remained exactly what it had always been. Foggy, gray, quietly haunted by things most of its people would never know existed, protected by an organization that had spent a century learning to carry that burden without breaking under it. But something had shifted, subtly and permanently, in the particular architecture of what that protection now meant. Millennium's forward operations lay in ruins, its chief architect held in a Hellsing cell that would yield, over the months ahead, thread after thread, leading toward something considerably larger and older than any of them had yet fully understood. Section XII watched from its own careful distance, wary, but no longer hostile, its doctrine quietly, permanently expanded, to make room for a possibility none of its theology had ever seriously entertained. And somewhere above all of it, unhurried and entirely unbothered by the scale of what he'd stumbled into, a god of destruction had decided, for reasons that had far less to do with cosmic duty than with fried food, an entertaining vampire, and a woman who'd had the sense to offer him tea instead of a bullet, that London was worth staying for. Integra Hellsing stood at her study window that evening, watching the city's lights flicker on beneath a sky, finally briefly clear of fog, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, something close to genuine hope. The war ahead of them, whatever shape it eventually took, whoever it eventually revealed itself to truly be, was far from over, But for the first time since Millennium's chippers had first begun surfacing in her city's dark corners, she did not feel as though she was facing it alone. Somewhere behind her, in the estate's garden, a god sat beneath the stars he could no longer casually travel between, in no particular hurry to leave, watching a strange, stubborn, endlessly complicated little world figure out, one crisis at a time, exactly how lucky it had gotten the night he fell through its floor.